Hello everyone and happy Boxing Day. I hope you've been managing to faint well and preferably keep your guard up. But, if necessary, just get in a few quick jabs and that should sort things out. Welcome to the Royal Navy built 15-inch armed Nelson class F3 designs and what changes for the London Treaty KGV class refits in World War II. Or as I'm preferring to call it, and this is, after all, one of the patron suggestions, what happens if someone decides to go for fast rather than bulwarks of power? I do rather like that. Now, I'm of course, as normal, joined by my fluffy research assistant, who is complaining. I'm not sure what about. You've been in the garden, you've been fed, you've been watered. You're not literally getting on stream and demand. Oh, I know what you're demanding. Excuse me, I'll be back in a second. He's not wearing something because he had to do something else. Hi. Okay, as you decided to join what I'm calling my channel's Christmas party, to get away from the Christmas party going on in there, you also get, as well as this, the reason you had this taken off, I have to give you this. So you've got your tablet, okay? Eat? No? Fine. Yeah. Yes. I do know how to get the chewing reflex to start on a puppy dog. Yes, I got your jumper. Sorry about this, everyone, but he needs his jumper. If he doesn't have his jumper and probably his other part of his party outfit, he'll be very upset with us for the entire time and will cause trouble the entire time. Hello, yes. Yes, I know. I'm putting it on the right way round. Good God. What it is to have a fashionista for a dog. Yeah. Oh. Yeah, I definitely know what it is they like to be woken up with a right hook in the face. And not be able to do anything about it. You okay? Oh, good boy. There you go. Got a bit of a turtleneck, haven't you? Yes, you have. It's a bit of a turtleneck. Now, you need your other thing. Ugh. I know. I'll get it for you. Right then. We're not having this on flashy because, frankly, that just makes you too distracting and too nutty. But there you go. Your full party gear is on. You're happy. Hello, everyone. I have now got a happy poodle. I've got Iron Brew. I can do this properly. How are we all doing today? No treats is the complaint. No, that wasn't the complaint. See? You think I don't know my dog? He's on screen and he's not in his party gear. He was upset. Yes, he has party gear. That wasn't force feeding him, that was giving him his tablet, which he won't eat unless you make him start chewing it. Yeah. So apologies everyone for that. I wanted to make sure I started on time. and I thought other people had done certain things. I must own up, because I had not done put your clothes on. So that is entirely on me. I'd forgotten about that. I thought you were sleeping, so didn't want that. That's on me. But yeah, it wasn't my turn to do your treatment today, was it? No, I do your other treatments, but I end up doing that as well. You okay? Oh, good father. Hello everyone, how are you doing? Hello Twitch, hello YouTube, hello everyone watching, hope you're having fun. Today's discussion, of course, as said, is what would the world be like? What would have happened to the world if the Royal Navy had gone for speed rather than unsinkable bulwarks? And you have to remember, the unsinkable bulwarks thing is something which the politicians are obsessed with, not so much the Navy, so this is not exactly an unlikely scenario. And it was the Navy who were developing the F3 sort of style, so it's one of those things of, this is not exactly a difficult route for me to go down. Now, first of all, you have to consider what stopped building and what the criteria are to come through in the construction. And those come through, of course, in the Washington Naval Treaty. And one of the interesting things is they are going to cover most of the period we're going to be talking about. Because, let's be honest, once you get to much past after 1930, you are in a lot of trouble in terms of trying to work these things out, and trying to work out which is going to be which and what's going to be what. Because you're into reactions and actions. You've got Article 2. Now, Article 2, of course, well, that's the fun one. The contracting powers may retain, respectively, the capital ships which are specified in Chapters 2, Part 1, da-da-da-da-da. But the important part for us is the third section of Article 2. Yes. It's the third section of Article 2. It's, the British Empire may, in accordance with the replacements table in Chapter 2, Part 3, construct 2 new capital ships, not exceeding 35,000 tons standard displacement each. On completion of said 2 ships, the Thunderer, King George V, Ajax and Centurion shall be disposed of as prescribed in Chapter 2, Part 2. That's okay. Then we have Article 3. Subject to provisions of Article 2, the contracting powers shall abandon their respective capital shipbuilding programs. So this means G3s and all those ones are out. Article 4. The total capital ship replacement tonnage of each contracting power shall not exceed the standard displacement for the United States and the UK, 525,000 tons, for France 175,000 tons, for Italy 175,000 tons, and for Japan 315,000 tons. No capital ship exceeding 35,000 tons standard displacement shall be acquired or constructed by, for, or within the jurisdiction of any of the contracting powers. And no capital ship of any contracting power should carry a gun with a caliber in excess of 16 inches. That's 406mm. Just put in, just in case people try and vary the size of the inch and the millimeter. So, that's your limitations. That's your Washington Naval Treaty. That's your criteria. Now, if you want to maximize things, then the 16-inch makes sense. That's why originally the British do go with the 16-inch for the narrow rods and do develop all these things. But the thing is, there are many good arguments against it. There are many, many, many good arguments against it. And yes, the Royal Navy is very happy to sacrifice ships they were getting rid of anyway. They were planning on replacing anyway. It's one of those things of, the Royal Navy was not keeping around anything under... The ship which was supposed to probably have lasted longest with the 13.5-inch guns would have been HMS Tiger. Literally, she's the most useful of the 13.5-inch gun ships left. And honestly, if the Royal Navy had been building as they'd planned, I think probably Tiger lasts until the second set of fast battleships or battle cruisers, whichever comes after the N3s are built, enters service. I don't think any of the older battleships last beyond the N3s, and possibly some of them go with the G3s. Now, yes, the Royal Navy was hoping to keep to a capital fleet of roughly 24 ships. That was 3 battle squadrons in the Atlantic, or Home Fleet, Mediterranean, and Eastern/Indian Ocean/ they keep coming up with different names for it, fleet. At different points.
But that was going to be roughly 24 capital ships. Now, you might think, well, Alex, why are they talking about capital ships in this scenario? Why aren't they talking about battle cruisers? Why don't they want enough battle cruisers for each? Well, think about it. Do you need a battle cruiser or a fastish battleship in the Mediterranean? Do you even need that fastish battleship? And again, for the home fleet, what's their job? What's the job of the Eastern Fleet? The Eastern Fleet is going to cover the whole Indian Ocean and Pacific and protect all the British colonies in that area. So in many ways, they're going to probably need battle cruisers far more than the other fleets. The Atlantic Fleet has quite a lot of economic areas to cover. So again, they're probably going to need battle cruisers. The Mediterranean Fleet is kind of like a warfighting fleet in terms of the Mediterranean, but also heavy reaction force for the other two fleets. So yeah, they can be concentrated battleships. So you're probably going to be structured around that. You're probably going to see a couple of battle cruisers in the home fleet. You're probably going to see... Well, my strong suspicion has always been the G3s would have ended up being the core of the Eastern Fleet. There would literally the four of them would have been the core of the Eastern Fleet. Because if you consider how they're designed with, some of the emphasis does go on the things like the dry dock facilities in India and Australia and Singapore, etc. And that makes sense. Those are going to be the longest ones, that are the ones which you're going to upgrade latest. Always when you start an upgrade cycle of dry dock facilities, you start with the home ones first. So they're going to upgrade the ones in the UK long before they get around to the ones in Singapore in the Far East. So G3s would have been the core of that fleet for about the next 16-20 years. More than likely. Hello. I have a poodle who is feeling slightly drained today. Lots of people. So he's very needy of... Now he's got just one human to deal with. He's had a lot of fun with lots of people. He does enjoy it, but he wears himself out with it. Oh, you go. Oh, you big floppy piece. Up you go. Oh, good. Okay. So, saying all this, making sure you don't put your leg in a place where you'll hurt yourself. With the Royal Navy thinking about this, and this being the Washington Naval Treaty, well, let's consider some of the options they considered. Now, the thing is, the Naval design, and that picture comes from... Let me just make sure I get it out. You never make things easy, do you? He's absolutely sure he's tiny. From this book, by John Roberts. And apparently from the archives, comes from one of the Newcastle archives, and that one. Now, the Elrod design is basically as close as you can get to an N3 design, which is produced for 35,000 tons. They are as close to a solid lump of steel as you're going to get. They are, in many ways, I would argue, the ultimate dreadnought battleship. Rather than being a fast battleship, rather than being anything else along that spectrum, they are the ultimate in terms of a dreadnought battleship. That is actually built. Not actually conceived, but actually built. And again, the thing you have to remember about this design is it's designed to be very efficient. Very efficient in operation in water, very efficient in terms of maintenance, very efficient in terms of what it's going to be carrying out around the world. It is... These are critical assets which the Royal Navy are going to depend upon. But again, building bulwarks and obsessing over 16-inch guns, those are political things. It's the politicians who decide that they have to have a 16-inch gun. Yes, Beatty is one of those politicians involved, and he is an admiral. But as you all know, Beatty is far more effective as First Sea Lord than he was ever as commander of the Grand Fleet, or any senior officer rank in the Grand Fleet. But the thing is, that's because he is far more of a politician than he is an admiral. And yes, you can argue, well, we need 16-inch guns, so we're part of the 16-inch club, which these major powers have. They all have, both Japan and America have 16-inch gun ships. And they do. We'll be getting onto the Nagato and the Colorados later. We'll be talking about them and comparing them, because that's a key thing which comes in. Comparisons with the Nagato and the Colorados. Key things they point out. Yes, there are people putting PT in the chat, I do notice, but currently he's getting lots of pats, so that's doing. That's you're going to be your PT for the moment. You're getting pats. And the thing is, these designs are crammed. But they're also rather cramped. That's why they're shaped the way they are. That's why you have B turret above, in terms of B turret is higher than A and C turret. It's to try and cut down the space it takes on the deck. Now, myself, I don't think it does actually cut down that much space. It really doesn't, because I've played around with it enough times in various things of UAD, etc. I really don't think it does. But that's what they're trying for. And of course, Naval rods have the 16-inch guns. As said, it's a political decision, but they're a new development. They're a new 16-inch gun. They are something for you to talk about, something for you to crow about. So there are lots of factors which do make these ships useful. But on the negatives, they're not really something you can send wandering around to foreign stations. They are not something you want to send off on long journeys around the world. So that's one of the reasons why Hood gets the prominence she has. As often said, Hood isn't the biggest, most powerful ship in the Royal Navy. She's isn't even the fastest. But she's given all this status because she's the biggest ship they can send round the world. And the most modern ship they can send round the world for nearly 20 years. So she is the image of the Royal Navy abroad. The point here is, and this is the point we're going to be considering, is that that's because the Naval design, you can't do that with. As good as the Naval designs are, they are probably, as said, the ultimate dreadnought battleship. That's what they are. That doesn't make them necessarily the best asset for the British Empire in this time period. And it's worthwhile noting that the Royal Navy, at the end of World War I, what have they been building? They've been building battle cruisers and battle cruisers. They've been trying to build that for their peacetime needs. Why? Because they're thinking about a global presence mission. Because they're thinking about not the war they've just fought, but the war to come and the likely powers involved. And really, at that point, none of them can see them being a likelihood of war against Germany again after this war's over, because they all know what they've been planning for the Treaty of Versailles. And there is no chance that Germany is going to be able to get back in the saddle in any time frame quickly enough to be a challenge to the Royal Navy on its own. In which case, you have to start looking around the other powers in the world. France gutted itself and has basically immolated itself politically. They don't become a dictatorship after the war. Italy, we talk about the rise of fascism, but there have been other threats before then, and that was always a potential threat coming through in Italy. And Japan. Japan, an ally. Quite a long time ally at this point. Not as long an ally as Portugal, but quite a long time ally. And well, Japan has problems. In many ways, the Washington Treaty helps the Royal Navy. It helps Britain because it provides a reason to get out of the alliance with Japan, which cannot be blamed on the British. It's suddenly not Britain's fault. Once again, it was the dastardly Americans who forced you open to the world, not the nice British who came along afterwards and might have done exactly the same thing, but Commodore Perry got there first, and so we got to be the good guys. And it's the dastardly Americans who force us to cut our alliance because of their fears. Not because you're turning into an unstable nutcase of a nation that we honestly worry about who's going to be in charge of from week to week. No, that's not it at all. No. It's all the Americans' fault. It's not us or you. We'll still be friends, we just can't be official friends anymore. Now, the thing is, we're going to get into some of the modifications, some of the changes done, but one of the interesting things that happens with the Naval design, if you carry on down this route, is honestly, the problem for the Royal Navy was always they didn't have enough of them. If you're going to do this, if you're going to go for a 23-knot ship before you activate forced draft, you always have to remember that. One of the criteria, and I don't think I've emphasized this enough on the channel going back and forth, but I found now enough examples that I can confidently say this pretty much every time, is that the Royal Navy measures the speed of its ships without there being forced draft. They build them so they can do forced draft in them, but they never measure their speed and list that as forced draft, their forced draft capable of speed. One of the interesting things you'll read if you open up and if you have a book which discusses the F3s is quite regularly is there's people who talk at various points about, well, this person said that if they actually did engage in forced draft, they could reach 30 knots, or 31 knots, or 32 knots. And you start to go, what? How? And they are a two-shaft design still. Who's torturing your brother? They're all watching movies and things in there. I know. So many people for the last 2 days. You've been made such a fuss of. So, the Nell rods are built. They're what are chosen. But let's consider the other designs being considered, because the important point is to think about is that while the actual treaty was going on and the Navy was designing without the politicians' input, without having government input and official government guidance, they're talking about F2 and F3s. They're talking about a 6-15-inch gun battle cruiser and an F3 which is slightly slower, but has 9 16-inch guns, but has slightly secondary. And when these are referred to as battle cruisers, I'd like to point out they are sufficiently far enough along the battlecruiser spectrum, kind of like the G3 designs, that I would probably be having a serious discussion with people about which side of the G3, which side of the battlecruiser fast battleship line they're on. It's kind of like, whereas Hood, I will quite happily argue to the nth degree, no, it was not a fast battleship under any circumstances. It starts off as a battlecruiser 2-word design, as the Admiral class do, and then tries to get involved post-Jutland into a battlecruiser 1-word design, and that's where all the problems come in. And the G3s and the F3s and the F3s and the F2s all start off firmly in battlecruiser territory, 1-word, i.e. they are successors to the Tiger, not to renowned Repulse and Hood. And in many ways, like Tiger, they are far enough along that spectrum that if you did a little bit of work, you would have a hard time arguing they were not fast battleships. Steve Clarke, yeah, it's the fully armoured battlecruiser phraseology again, kind of like Vanguard. And as I've explained before, the reason why Vanguard is called a fully armoured battlecruiser in Royal Navy parlance is because she has battlecruiser level subdivision, but she's fully armoured. Which is why some people turn around and go, well, you know, she's a fast battleship, and that's what the Royal Navy would have called the Iowas a fully armoured battlecruiser. They wouldn't have, because they've got battleship, well, a fast battleship level subdivision. They've got tighter subdivision. And that's the whole point. These are, well, yeah, fully armoured battlecruisers about 20 years earlier. It goes battlecruiser 2-word, battlecruiser 1-word, fast battleship, then dreadnought battleship. And as said, the Nelrod design is in many ways the ultimate battleship, the ultimate dreadnought battleship. These are not. These are battle cruisers, but they are fully armoured battle cruisers in many ways. So this is the point. These ships, though, are different. There's a differential. Honestly, the F2 could be argued to be some ways better. It's got all the armament of a renowned class, so it's a perfectly decent ship in terms of firepower. You can't argue against something which has a renowned class firepower. Better because it's actually got 15-inch 50s, and it then has six 6-inch guns either side. It has all the other accoutrements you want, and is a knot faster, pretty much. Its official top speed is 30, and it's also got heavier armor. So it definitely is in the. I'm honestly not a fast battleship. I am a battle cruiser, but a fully armored battle cruiser category. The F3 is slightly. I would say it's got the heavier armament, but it's slightly further along. It's slightly more into the towards battle cruiser than fast battleship because it's got slightly less sort of cover, slightly less armor, but still pretty darn decent armor. Pretty darn decent. In fact, if we do a proper comparison and a proper contrast, in the vitals comparison between the three classes, and you know, I put it here. Quiet. No, you can't keep demanding food. You might get something in a bit, if you behave. They're all supposedly officially 35,000 tons, according to their legend. In terms of their standard displacement, the F2 and F3 weren't officially worked out. Various funds I've seen usually lead to roughly 33,500 tons to 34,000 tons. The modified Nelsons, the 03 modified design, which was the Nelsons, were 33,313 tons in standard for Nelson, 33,730 tons for Rodney. Yes, Rodney displaced 417 tons more than Nelson. Rodney always was slightly bigger. You'll notice they all have the 106-foot beam. 106-foot beam. Length for the F2, which is the fastest, is 720 feet between the perpendiculars, 760 foot overall. The F3, 700 foot between the perpendiculars, 740 foot overall. And the Nelson is 660 feet perpendicular, 710 feet overall. So you can see the F3 actually does sit roughly in the middle of the designs. It's 30 foot longer than the Nelson, but it's 20 foot shorter than the F2. They got about the same draft. It's got about twice the shaft horsepower, more than twice the shaft horsepower of the Nelson. But it still has two shaft designs. As far as me and Drac have been able to research and find out, both all the designs were tin shaft design. So it really does show how much effort has been put into the shaft design to the point that they can now put this much power through two shafts. Speed. Well, under deep conditions, it's 29.5 knots for F2, 28.5 knots for F3, and 23 knots for Nelson. Light conditions, 30 knots for F2, 29 knots for F3, and officially it's still 23 knots for Nelson. Armor. 13-inch at 72 degrees over the magazines, and 12 inches at 72 degrees over machinery for the F2. F3 belt was 12 inches at 72 degrees over machinery and magazines. And for Nelson, it's 14 inches at 72 degrees over the magazines and 13 inches over the machinery. Now, I have no idea why that has not updated with the other armor, with the rest of the armor in it. But rather than writing it up, I've got it sitting here, so I'll just use the book. And this is the book where all the armor stuff comes from, so I'll put this up on screen as well to show you all, because it's always sensible to do that and to show it off so you can all see it. Now, barbettes were within 15 to 12 inches. Turrets, 16.5 inches on the face, 11 inches on the side, 9 inches on each side, and 9 inches on the back, 7.5 inches on the 7.25 inches on the roof. Bulkheads were 12 inches and 18 inches forward and 10 inches and 4 inches aft. So in some regards, the bulkheads, everything is just a little bit thicker. On the Nell rods, it's just a little bit thicker, right? There's also officially the fact that they weren't going to be fitted with torpedo tubes, but that might have been something that was added in later. And it's like, again, you have to remember, these are the designs as given at this stage. This is the 03 modified, not the 03 original design that they kind of draw from, but the modified design, where they've made some compromises, where you've had something go, I'd like some torpedoes actually in, and we'll develop some 24.5-inch torpedoes, and oh, I'd like some 4.7-inch guns in for AAE, so we need to add in those and make those changes. So there's going to be adaptations. But broadly speaking, what you're getting is, this has probably got the weakest armor of all the three options, but it's still got armor which is freaking solid. 12 inches of armor at 72 degrees over magazines and machinery spaces. That's solid armor. That's a solid 12-inch belt. 14-inch belt over magazine, 13-inch over machinery, 13-inch and 12 inches over machinery. It's a case of, yeah, what we do. And you might even see this changed. There is a possibility they go, well, actually, no, we'll accept it being slightly slow. We'll put it in the force draft, all these things. There are changes which could be made. There are changes which could be done. And you had to remember, some of the water as armor work goes in and develops as this period is going on. So that goes into this design. It's not present in this design, which could change some of the calculations again. What you could see in this one is it could be raised to 12.5-inch belt overall over machinery and magazines, and that will be fine. Then you're cool. 30 knots out of 2 shafts. What are magic were they wanting to pull out or to be able to pull that? Well, I'm fairly sure the shafts weren't solid. That's my first decision. Then if you've got the latest in Brown Curtis and Brown Curtis turbines, Admiralty boilers, some well-designed hulls, you can probably pull that 30 knots out. So the F2 is sort of Vanguard. Well, that's what I say. If you look through this, Vanguard has a between 4.5-inch and 14-inch armored belt. Let's be honest, there's not much differential going on here. Now, are these as solid as this? No. But this is a 5.5 knot advantage in deep over this, officially. And this has a 6.5 knot advantage. Same number of main battery guns, but these are 15-inch versus 16-inch. And again, there's always the option here of, what would happen if they made this a 15-inch gunship? If they'd gone with this a 15-inch 50 gunship, could they have used that at weight save to put in extra power? Could they have got them up to 25 knots, 26 knots in normal form? And again, please note, force draft, it does do damage to the engines. It does increase wear. There's a reason why navies don't want to do it. So there's a reason why the Royal Navy always, when they're quoting speed and testing speed, are going, oh, this is our speed. They're not doing force draft. They put in all the equipment to do force draft, but they don't do it. This is one of the reasons why myself and Drac are fairly certain that that Rodney gets up to 26 knots during World War II. Because once you've turned on force draft, once you've done you've opened all the taps and you're prepared to push the turbines, especially with turbines that you're going to be replacing anyway, so you're prepared to wreck them a bit. Getting those extra 3 knots is not going to be beyond the realms of possibility. And interestingly enough, there isn't a world of difference between the machinery specs going into these ships. There isn't a massive world of difference. But again, please note this design, this design, which is officially 28.5 knots, 29 knots. There are designers who are quite happily saying, naval architects who are quite happily quoting at the time, who are referenced in this book and in a few others which I've read, who were saying, well, under forced draft, we will probably be able to achieve 30, 31 knots. That's a scary beast. If you think about this period, we're talking something with 12 inches of armor, angled at 72 degrees. So it's just sort of that. Which means in practice, if you are hitting it at a flat trajectory, unless you're hitting it just right, you're pretty much going to find yourself facing the same goal as 13 inches plus of armor. 13 inches plus of armor. So, yeah. Hello, Ibex. And yeah, hope everyone's having a lovely Christmas. Edirov, could a fully armored battlecruiser be the halfway point between battlecruiser and fast battleship? Technically, it is the halfway point, but oh good lord, I don't want to add in another thing into the section because there's only one navy which actually produces one of those ships. But that's also pretty much what the Royal Navy's talking about here. And to an extent, you could argue the G3s were heading at that direction. And yeah. And the 15-inch 50 is looking like a good gun. It really is looking like a good weapon system. A good option for the Royal Navy. It's basically, you're taking all the recipe for the 42... and you are adding another 120 inches onto it, or 10 feet. Not a bad option. Bijan, no. The Iowa class are fast battleships. They just are. Makes me wonder if the F3 goes on a weight like the O3 design, then adding another inch or two of armor could work. Well, yeah, that's the thing I've already talked about. There is a very real possibility that... Well, what I would say with the F3 design, what they probably would do is up it. If they are going to put the extra weight anywhere, if they're going to do anything, it would be upping that armor to 13 inches at 72 degrees all over. So instead of having a 14-inch and a 13-inch belt like the Nelrod, or a 13-inch and a 12-inch belt like the F2, they'll go for a 13-inch belt the whole way across. The Nelsons and these ships all have internal armor. They also have deck armor of 7 inches over the magazines and 3.25 inches over the machinery. They all have a lot of protection. Gregory Zukov, I've done enough videos on the subject. I can tell you to go look at the G3 videos I've done on this channel, but they are not battleships. Under no circumstances do they have the subdivision to be battleships. They are battle cruisers. That's fine, though. That's what the Royal Navy was building them as. And seeing as the Royal Navy at the time was the only navy in the world which had a fast battleship program and actually tried to build a fast battleship, failed, but tried with the Queen Elizabeths, had battle cruiser programs, had built battle cruisers, and built battleships. If they're calling it a battle cruiser, then they probably know what they're talking about. So, if you want to go argue that on the videos, with the videos where I've talked about the G3s, but the G3s were battle cruisers. Their subdivision, everything else works out, and that's the point. People often just concentrate on the external figures of, this is how thick the armor is, so that's a battleship, so it's a battleship, etc. But it's to do with the coverage of the hull, how much of the armor covers the hull, not just the thickness, but also what the subdivision is behind it, and all those things. So it all builds together to make what is this ship in this category. It's not just a simple thing of, oh, that armor, that must be that. No, it's what's the subdivision, what's the level of armor coverage, what is this ship, what is the sort of all things building in the ship. So, if we carry on from that, and we do tend to carry on from that, we come to this. Why did the British government go with the unsinkable bulwarks? Okay, it's literally down to two things. One, our government were nuts at the time. No. You see, the trouble is, the government is full of people kind of like Winston Churchill at the time, who have a belief they understand naval affairs, but who actually don't really understand the things. Because to their mind, they are refighting the last war. They are still stuck in the last war, and that's quite common for quite a lot of people, actually, this time period. And to their mind, they're refighting the Battle of Jutland. And the whole reason the British didn't win the Battle of Jutland was because battle cruisers got sunk. The whole reason, of course, the battle of cruisers got sunk is they should never have been in the places they were in the battle in the first place, and honestly they should look at Beatty for that one. But there's also Jellicoe and a few others where the blame should probably go round because, well, if you have a subordinate who's not listening to you, you should probably try to get rid of them a bit more harder. But that's the problem. In this point, the UK government, yeah, kind of like the US Congress, Zirkov, and so they want to build unsinkable bulwarks of the battle line. This is despite the Royal Navy turning around to go, you do realise there's never going to be a battle like Jutland ever again. There's never going to be another battle line on battle line battle. That was the last. No, we've got to build it. And you actually see this phraseology. We need unsinkable bulwarks of the battle line! Now, if you've ever heard the lawyer speech, if you've got the facts on your side, you argue facts. If you've got the spirit of the law on your side, argue the law. And if you've got neither, then you bang your fists on a table and you shout as loud as you can. Well, guess what they're doing in this debate? They're banging their fists on the table. They're shouting as loud as they can. The whole time. And basically, BT, the debate doesn't even really get public. It's the walls of the House of Commons going backwards and forwards, And BT, that person who has been obsessed with battlecruisers ever and whose career is tied to them, goes, well, yes, because it is inclined to accept it for two reasons. One of them, by accepting it, it neatly excuses them of any blame for the Battle of Jutland. It's not BT's fault the ships got sunk. It's the fact that they were not unsinkable bulwarks of the battle line. They were battle cruisers. It's not BT's fault. The other reason he goes along with them is because he wants a 16-inch gunship because he thinks he needs to be equal. It's what he needs to be able to stand up his head next to the Americans. This despite the designers. BT is the first Sea Lord by this point, Georgy Zirkov. He is not just a admiral, he is the admiral as far as Britain is concerned at this point. He's actually fairly good for the politics side because he's got a lot of political capabilities, but he is also looking after his own self. And he wants a 16-inch gunship because the Americans and the Japanese have them, so Britain needs them. And to be fair, the British have argued pretty much they need to get these two new battleships based off the argument that they should have 16-inch gunships like the others do. So yeah, this is the argument which goes through. This is the argument. And that's not an unusual argument, let's be honest. As arguments go, that's making their case. It's all about the politics. You'll notice, though, that the Nelson, this is the case, of course, the Nelson has the secondary armament of the F2s, though. So basically, what they've done is they've gone, Right then, so we've given them the heavier armour than the F2s, the secondary armament of the F2s. We've given them the brand new 16-inch guns. So they have ticked all the boxes to try and make the most powerful asset they can make. But the trouble is, it's for the battle line, not the battle fleet. It's for, in many ways, refighting the Battle of Jutland. If you'd had Nelson and Rodney at the Battle of Jutland, goodness gracious me, you'd have done scary things to them. I think we can all agree that having Nelson and Rodney at the Battle of Jutland would refight the Battle of Jutland. They would do nasty things to the German Navy. The Kaiserlich Marine would be all kinds of mucked up if those two were at the Battle of Jutland. Now the thing is, as someone like me would point out, who's a technicality person, would point out that the Royal Navy did get them for roughly 33,300 tons, or 33,730 tons. So you do have roughly 1,000 tons left you could have played with to buck up the horsepower a bit, and buck up the engines a bit, so they could have been a bit faster. You could have made them a bit longer, a bit faster. This is 40 foot shorter than this one. Does 1,000 tons make a difference? Does 1,000 tons allow you to make up some of that 40 feet and some of that speed? I would argue it would. But the thing was, they were trying to keep clear blue water between them and the stand displacement limitations. Trying to keep clear blue water. 25 knots in all conditions from HMS Verdun. I'm sure there are a few others who have different ideas on that, but my view is... Let me put it this way. If we consider they're all two-shaft designs, right? The turbines put in these are it's similar sized turbine units between all three in the designs. In fact, but these two have the same size turbine design, and the difference between the turbine design shape for this one is near as enough. Makes no difference space wise. So what we're talking about is boilers. Right? To get the high pressure steam. And the thing is, these have 8 Admiralty free drum boilers. This design, these ones, we're talking 12 boilers. Roughly. So, 12 boilers, stressed to a slightly higher level than the 8 boilers put in here, gets you to this or this, depending on how you're designing the ship and arranging turbines. Yeah, if you'd made these ships 15-inch gun ships, I personally think the F3 and F2s are estimated to be roughly 33,000 tons as well. 33 to 33,500 tons as well. I wouldn't be surprised in standard. I would not be surprised if you could have got something a lot closer to the F3 in terms of operating parameters for an extra 1,500 tons or an extra 1,000 tons from the O3. And that's based on looking at these. They're all two-shaft design. Now, I have to say, there's part of me which is sitting there going, no, you shouldn't do that through two shafts, because there's a part of me which has been raised by a naval architect who will always tell you you need a first shaft and all the other things, and that's true, and I usually do keep to it, because it's just... But the thing is, the naval architects of this period are very sure they could do it through two shafts. Now, my view is that that's going to increase engine wear if you need to do higher speed operations. It is going to increase wear and tear on the ships. But there again, they're warships. They're made to be used, they're made to be worn down, they're made to be risked. That's what you have warships for. You don't have them to sit in port and polish, you have them to use. And using them is a risk. Using them is always a risk. So, again, if you took these down to 15-inch 50 guns, and they didn't have the 16-inch guns, that would give you more tonnage to spare. Still want 80 rounds per gun, but you'd have 9 guns. And also, if you lengthen out the seat, you probably end up with an F3 shape anyway, because if you lengthen out the hull design, as you can see from this design shaping, the way they're structured, it gives them actually slightly better clearance for their guns. Especially if you consider B turret able to fire forward. So if you consider range fire forward, B turret in this design elevation has a better operating characteristics than this one, where the B turret, than C turret does in this when it's tucked behind B turret. Now, admittedly, that doesn't matter if you're angling your approach. But the thing is, with the greater speed you have here, you both have the better radius of fire for your guns, and the greater ability to angle your approach to better suit your guns. It's a fun conversation. But the decision was made. So that we reached the shameless book plug portion of the thing, where I say thank you very much to who likes, shares, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you to everyone who's bought a copy of my book. As you might know, I'm a naval historian and academic, and all my research is funded by this channel. All my research is funded by you and your support. So all the money that comes in goes towards buying books, buying pictures for books, so I can write more books, which is what I'm doing, and what I did Historiathon for not that long ago, and all sorts of things. That's what I do it for. Okay? So literally, this channel is how I fund my research. So I don't go to grant committees. I don't go to any organisation going, yes, what do you want me to do? I will do that. Please give me the money. I instead go, I produce all these videos on this channel. I hope you like them. If you like my work, please help me create more, help me do more books, help me do those things by funding the channel. It's a very different model, but I quite like it. And this and what's coming up. There's going to be the Patreon premiere, which got moved from last Wednesday due to technical difficulties. Is going to be out tomorrow. The Battle of Ely, the Long Patrol's out on Saturday. Bruchit's 176 is on Sunday. And then on 30th of December is going to be HMAS Vampire. 31st of December, hopefully going to be 2 Historians, which is going to be recorded on the 30th of December. And then Command Switch. How command changes at various points. I've got the actual title right at the back at the beginning, which helped to go to. Make sure I get it right. Yeah. Andrew Moore, round holes full of square pegs. Where could you unloved commanders get postings where they could have shone? There are a few commanders who are going to be in that, and it's a nice one to start the year, put into Year of Leadership as the first, as one in Year of Leadership. And, yeah, that's basically coming out on the 1st. And then we're into January. And we have the Battle of Barents Sea on next Thursday. Key Leaders on Friday, the first episode of that. A Long Patrol from this live. And then we have Bruchit's 177. And then we're carrying on. And I'm going to try and do more 2 historians. So please do. If there's any historians you'd like to appear on 2 historians, like I've had Drac, like I've had Sal, like I've had Simon Elliott, like I've had Harry Bennett, which was a lot of fun for me, getting one of my PhD examiners to come here. It was great fun. The fact is, I got on with all my examiners and my supervisors. They were nice to me. It'll be fun. Count Grumman, I'm curious about one thing. With publishing a number counting in academia, do the number of Kindle sales count towards that? Some universities they do, some universities don't accept Kindle sales. Some do, some don't. Ibex, better use of the Queen Elizabeth, escort Tiger. Look, in nicest way, Tiger managed to avoid being BT's flagship for her entire career, Ibex. Stop doing that to her. He was a bored lion. He was a bored lion. The whole time, not Tiger. Tiger kept him away from her. Yes, I'm going to get Andrew Lambert. Yes, I'm trying for Kate. John Partial. I'd love to have John on. I'd love to have John on. It'd be a lot of fun. It would be a lot of fun. So, why go F3? Well, you see, the thing was, the argument going through, and this was the argument which was made, and I would say the trouble is you have the constructor at the time of yours, they are not Henderson. They are not some of the admirals who come later, who would even come before World War I when it comes to dealing with politicians. They are relying on BT, they're relying on the political capabilities of him. And as said, I don't necessarily consider him unbiased in this situation. For him, building unsinkable bulwarks kind of burnishes his reputation by going, it wasn't his fault. It were not his fault. Which is one of the annoying things which happens in this period. One of the annoying things. I have a whole book which I do like to get out occasionally at this point called The Unpublished Reports from Jutland. There it is. So if you've never read this one, Jutland Scandal, it's by Vice Admiral John Harper and Admiral Reginald Bacon. Now, they are not particularly unbiased sources, but one of them writes the original paper about Jutland and the lessons learned, which is then suppressed by BT and has to be rewritten because it suggests he did bad things. And one of them is a absolute gunnery, etc. enthusiast par excellence and knowledgeable person and one of the better admirals of the Royal Navy in World War One. Leaving that, therefore, to one side, this is what, if you've been basing, it's kind of interesting, is that the information being based to design the F3s and the F2s, and the G3s, the N3s, comes from the original writing of the report. It all comes from the original report's conclusions. The O3s and decisions after that, with BT overseeing it and pushing it through, many ways feature later versions of the report. Best books on Royal Navy capital ships? Oh, there's so many to be good for, but yeah, John Roberts has a lot of good ones. John Roberts has a lot of good ones. Basically, John Roberts has written most of the expert ones. Drac hasn't done one yet. He's starting off with the with a cruiser with HMS HMS Belfast. But if you want a good read on the Battle of Jutland, this one is very good. So, in what I'm making the point of, well, let's put it this way. If the controller at the time, and they're nice enough, but the third Sea Lord in this period, and I want to make sure I get their surname correct, otherwise, because I'm just going to call them their nickname, and that just is rude. Sir William Nicholson and then Sir Frederick Field. And Sir Frederick Field is a pretty darn capable admiral. He'd served in the Boxer Rebellion. He had all sorts of experience. He'd been in charge of the battle cruiser squadron 1923 to 1925, but he was third Sea Lord 1920 to 1923. Now, he would later be First Sea Lord, and he was the one who was the first Sea Lord during the Invergordon Mutiny. And, well, he was ill when it was pushed through by Austin Chamberlain. And the Invergordon Mutiny, but leave that to one side. Field has a habit of being ill, it seems, on occasions when he needs to be around for politics, but he's a fairly decent admiral. But he's not good at the politics side. He's not good at managing the politicians. Oh, Castle of Steel is good. Norman Freeman's books are good. They are good, but John Roberts' books, I usually... If I give an example, this is an older one of Roberts' books, but there are newer versions of Roberts' books. And the reason I'm pointing, if you're going to be asking me about this, is the fact that it's got lots of very, very good plans in, okay? So Roberts' books tend to have a lot of detailed plans in, which I like. So, for example, this is Warspite, a full deck plan of her, and that sort of thing, so I like that. That'd be fun. Well, yeah, I'd be happy for them to come, but I don't have contacts for either of Skynear History or Important History. I would love both of them to come on. I would love to have a chat with them. Richard Perkins, I can't remember, but we do Gergi. That's what Brew Ships is all about. Brew Ships is a book review. I know it's often just questions answered, especially since I've been recovering from pneumonia, but it is getting back into its book review habits, and there are lots of books going to review there. So if you go and look through Brew Ships history, you'll probably find we've reviewed lots of books on battleships at various points. Now, the thing is, if Field had been more like Henderson or like Jellicoe when he was Third Sea Lord, he'd have probably gone round and pointed out to the Treasury that the 15-inch 50 uses the same shells that they currently have in production and have in store for their 15-inch gunships, so logistically would be easier. That it would also be an easy upgrade for the existing ships to make them more useful for longer. In other words, meaning they could put off replacement for longer. Another advantage for the Treasury. And that 15-inch 50, because it's an improved 42, represents a very low-risk option. A very low-risk option. Thanks, Gareth Gafoot. I hope you're enjoying them. And the thing is, if you win the argument with the Treasury, based on cost grounds, you tend to win the arguments with the other departments. Even at this point in Britain's development, the Treasury has a bit of a whip hand. And see, sometimes the parsimoniousness of the Treasury can actually be to the Navy's advantage. If you know how to use it. And by the way, this is nothing which Henderson or Jellicoe, and a couple of other Third Sea Lords I can think of, on top of my head, got up to. So it's not without precedent. And Field is fairly good in terms of strategy. One of the interesting things is he's not good at politics, but he is good at strategy. He is good, and he's one of the people who comes up with basically our plans for how to defend the Far East and comes up with a doctrine of it. It's then not delivered by anyone, but yeah. So, for the Royal Navy, this represents an option. I think, and the trouble is they were trying to sell them as fast and speed, and that lost to unsinkable bulwark. If you'd sold them as cost effective, Verdun, the shell for the 15-inch 50 is the same shell as the 15-inch 42. They have exactly the same shell. They both use the same shell. They have the same breech mechanism. The only difference is it's a 50 cal barrel rather than a 42 cal barrel. And it's a very good barrel. A very good barrel. The limited testing that seems to be done of it does suggest that they are longer ranged. And again, you're going to have the latest turrets. And also, again, but the thing is, the 15-inch gun, 15-inch 50 versus the 16-inch 45, not that much difference in length. Okay? So the 16-inch 50, the 15-inch 50 is 750 inches long. The 16-inch 45, well, that, by my small calculations, and I do mean my small calculations, is 670 inches long. So actually the 15-inch 50 is a longer weapon. Which also suggests that maybe if you kept the 16-inch gun, considering it's slightly shorter, leaves you more deck space to have those turrets, the barrels spring around. But we'll leave that to one side. We'll leave that all to one side. And as you've pointed out, Mark Harkness, this is the other point of the argument. And as I mentioned earlier, you have the ability to now upgrade all the other 15-inch armed ships in the Royal Navy. And you can do this because you're not changing the caliber. You can upgrade all the guns. So think about this now. Hood could have 15-inch 50s. Renown Repulse, 15-inch 50s. In fact, the only ships in the Royal Navy which couldn't be upgraded would be the 13.5-inch gunships. Only ships. All the 15-inch ships, all the R-class battleships would have 15-inch 50s. All the Queen Elizabeths could have 15-inch 50s. All of them could be upgraded. And the thing is, I would say this also adds in other points, because if I was the Royal Navy, I'd also say, isn't this also us seeking a more peaceful approach to the world? Because whilst they have to have 16-inch ships, we know 15-inch is fine. We don't need to be so aggressive. We can be more... We are the better people. We are the people who've learned more from war. Because, let's be honest, the penetrating difference between a 15-inch 50 Greenboy shell fired by a 15-inch 50 gun is so much less than a 16-inch 45 shell. Oh, no, it's not. It's actually probably more. Oh, okay. Okay, alright. We'll leave that to one side. So, and at that point, the differences between the 16-inch 45 and the 15-inch 50 are not that great. And honestly, it's okay. Now, I've said, no, the 15-inch 45 is lighter than the 15-inch 42. The 15-inch 50... It seems to be a little bit heavier, but not much so than the 15-inch 42. Okay, due to differences in alloys used and metals used. So the 15-inch 45 is lighter than the 42. The 15-inch 50 is slightly heavier, but it's not so much. And again, it's going to give you... It gives you a boost in range, and it gives you a boost in range of fire, which is going to help you in other ways. The new turret's probably about 30 degrees elevation. The 15-inch 50 is better because of the time it's produced in this period. That's what's available in this period. The 15-inch 45 isn't available to about isn't on development option until 1937. The 45 is probably slightly better than the 50 in terms of barrel life, but the 50 is better in terms of range and is technologically viable in 1920. So that's the thing. In 1920, you have the choice of the 15-inch 50 or the 16-inch 45. Those are the barrels you have on the development at that time. So that's your choice. You could, I suppose, go back to the 15-inch 42 and just go with what you have historically. But if you want a new ship, a new gun, which is going to give you status, your options are a 16-inch 50 or a 15-inch 50 or a 16-inch 45. Yes, 96 everyone, but you... So 9. Whilst, yes, the 15-inch 50, if built with the same materials as the 15-inch 45, which is designed in 1937, would be better. Would have better, would be lighter. The thing is, the 15-inch 45 and the materials which develop it aren't available till the 1930s after roughly another 15 to 15 odd years of technical metallurgical development. So it might be better, but that's 15 years away in the future at this point, and I am going with what's available at the time. I'm not doing fantasy history. I'm trying to do an alternate history. And whilst there is always this level of this is the logic which I'm going to follow because this is what I think is going to happen in alternate history, there is a point at which if I just go, right, I'm going to make a gun which is from 17 years in the future, gun design, peer back now, that is kind of me messing a bit much with history. This is all stuff which was available at the time, in the time period available. So this is not a technological, this is not me changing anything other than the decision made. This is me actually going, so instead of option A on their list, they pick option B on their list. What happens? Which is what I was asked to do. Which is why I like the Patreon questions. So what does the F3 bring to the table? Well, gives you 9 guns. 9 15-inch 50s. It gives you 4 6-inch guns either side. And 2 pairs, which, let's be honest, is not quite as good, but there is space for a lot of 4.7s. And there is space for easy aircraft storing aft, again, as with Rodney and Nelson and Rodney. So, yeah. Stella, no, it's not the material science that affects the 16-inch guns. It's the fact that the Royal Navy gets a false positive from their testing of German guns. They get a false positive and they go with it. It's like anything. You do some testing, it can give you false results, and it's only later on testing they realise, oh frigate, we took the wrong lessons from this testing results. It's what happens with humans and what happens with anything. You know, you can have produce some testing, get some results, think, oh, this proves what I was doing, then carry on and then realise actually it didn't. It's mostly all sorts of interesting things. Honestly, the gun metallurgy is not. The length and the gun, there's a gun philosophy that's taken from the German testing. The interesting thing is the Royal Navy very quickly realizes the gun metallurgy in Britain was ahead of the Germans, and the armor metallurgy was definitely ahead. And in World War II, they are absolutely certain it's ahead. In World War II, when they're looking at the German armor after World War II, they realized that German quality control on their battleship armor was atrocious. But you know, that's in the reports. Both the Americans and the Germans after World War II, Americans and the Brits after World War II, looking at the German armor, are just going, this is not good. There's issues, and it's basically a case of the Germans have very good experimental stuff, so they can design lots of very high quality stuff, but then it's turning into a mass production volume and turning into the volume they need and keeping up the volume they need for all the rest. And Nightbot is going after Bigeron. Bigeron, you know Nightbot doesn't like capital little caps. Anyway, so what does it bring to the table? It's not just speed, it's also its range of operations. The thing is, with having the draft they do, with having the shaping they do, with how they can do worldwide operations. So one of the things you're going to realise is these are going to slot in, not in terms of battle squadrons, but slot in with the fast squadron. So they're going to slot in with probably with Tiger, with Renown, Repulse, with Hood. So you're going to have these ships on rotation going around the world. This means this is going to become a visible part of the British presence. It's not going to be a case of everything resting on Hood. This is going to change the world view of the Royal Navy very quickly. Because these ships are also fast enough that you can afford to deploy them places and bring them back. You can afford to get them there and bring them back. And that is a useful thing to do. Yeah, it's always 14.7 inches in terms of the King George V arm belt. They're just some sources tend to round that up to 15 inches, Gregory, but it was always 14.7. It's just some sources insist on rounding things because they believe it gets more complicated. And actually, the interesting thing about British armour is all these inches I'm giving are a standardised referencing, but actually the Royal Navy at the time didn't order in terms of inches, they ordered in terms of weight. So yeah, it's weight of armor per certain space of that they are ordering in. So it's not actually thickness, it's weight. So it gets even more fun when you're trying. So we're always talking when we're giving these inches. We're giving you a very much a standardized methodology that we apply across all the different navies, because all the different navies order in a slightly different way their armor, and so therefore we starting to just standardize it in a way we can make it comparable, but it's not actually accurate. I will someday do a whole video on the armoring schemes and how they come about, different navies they come about. But the trouble is, I need to spend some time in the American archives looking at some of their history, and in the Japanese archives looking at some of their history. And whilst I hopefully get to the Japanese archives this year, the American archives I don't see myself getting to anytime soon, because of just the expense of going across to it and having to and sitting in the archives, and the fact that when I'm on one of those trips, I can't do my other work I do, which helps me pay the bills and all things, because as much as I love doing history, I do other work to pay the bills and get food and pay, keep the lights on, those things. Yeah, it's just fun. But the thing is about these ships is they won't just be, they're going to be about part of the presence around the world. Now, I think this is a really interesting thing, because I think this might actually mean Tiger is actually in service more often. Because if you have 6 ships running around the world, you'll be able to have that post. So, that the whole deployment of Hood on the Hood's round the world tour. The Special Service Squadron going around the world, the Empire Cruise. Well, that's a lovely thing. And you would probably still have that, but you might well have Nelson and Rodney do one of those in the late 1920s. And so you're going to have these ships going around the world quite often. Battleships are going to be turning up, the capital ships are going to be turning up fairly regularly. And that's going to have an effect on Australia, that's going to have an effect on India, that's going to have an effect on the wider British Empire, but also on how foreign powers perceive you. And whilst Hood doesn't visit Japan, doesn't visit Japan but does visit America. I wouldn't be surprised if Nelson and Rodney do visit Japan on their tour, because I would say, if I was sensible and if I was running this tour, right, so the Empire Tour, you have to remember, takes place between 1923 and 1924. Nelson and Rodney, historically, come into service, are commissioned in 1927. August and December 1927. So this cruise will probably take place 1928 to 29, right? You send them around the world to show off to the world. Look at these ships. If you visit in that period, remembering that the Battle of Tsushima takes place in September 1905, if you manage to get to Japan for September 1930, design it, sort of put it, stake it 28, 29, 20 or 29, 30. You would be able to, there for the 25th anniversary of Tsushima, you'd be turning up with your brand new battleships to sort of say hello. And just before the naval treaties begin. Just before your battle cruisers show up. And that's gonna be you going up and going, oh yes, we want to show these off to Togo Hayachiro. Now you can imagine how the Royal Navy would probably play that. It'd be a very successful little policy of theirs. It'd be a very interesting way of them going, yeah, look how friendly, how kind we are, how good we are. And the point is, the other thing that allows is for the Royal Navy, if you've got these are the fast ships that the Royal Navy's working with, and they're working with 6 fast ships, suddenly, if you need to send a couple of ships into reserve to be maintained, if you want to send them into yards to be upgraded, it's fine, you still have 4. One of the constant issues they have throughout the 1920s and late 1920s and early throughout the 1930s, is they only have 4 fast capital ships, and eventually once Tiger goes, they only have 3. And so they have to be really careful about which one of those goes into refit, because then they're down to 2. Well, suddenly, if you've got 6 for the late 1920s, early 1930s, that changes things a lot. You can suddenly go, well, I'm going to send both Repulse and Hood in for a refit. Can you afford to? Yeah. I've still got Tiger, Nelson, Rodney, and Renown. Or, I'm going to keep Tiger in service because that makes sense for gunnery training. Yes, Raptor, you're quite right. There would also be all sorts of talk about long-last friendship, etc. when they turned up. Just to point out, look at how good our ships are. Look at how capable. And think about this again from these fast ships' perspective. We would have 2 fully armoured one battle cruiser of 28 knots. 2 fully armoured battle cruisers of 28.5 knots. 3 battle cruisers of 32 knots. That's a fairly fast force for the Royal Navy. That's a fairly capable force. And that's a force which allows them to go, so we have problems in the Far East, we can get there. Think about this from another perspective. Tiger starts to make sense because she operates at the same speed as Nelson and Rodney now. You've now got 2 divisions which roughly equal speed. So yes, Tiger might have only have 8 13.5-inch guns, but suddenly she's even more useful than she was historically, because she slots in with those two. You've got a 3-ship group, all operating at roughly 28 knots. And the same with Renown, Repulse, and Hood. They all operate roughly at 32 knots. So you've got 2 divisions of fast ships. Roughly. Traditionally, a division is 4 ships in a battle squadron. You have 2 divisions, each made up of 4 ships. And you have 8 ships in the squadron. That's the traditional form. But you, under the naval treaties, you're only allowed a certain number of ships. You're only allowed 525,000 tons. You can't do that, therefore. You can't do that, therefore. So, yeah. You have to think about this. You have to think about, what do you want to be? What do you need to be? What is it valuable for you to be? And having these 2 divisions allows you to probably keep about 4 ships in various stages of operation at all times. Which is useful. Now, I've just been reminded by good old YouTube that I haven't put in an advert at the hour point like I was supposed to. It's almost an hour and a half. So I'm going to put in an advert before YouTube gets really mad with me. There you go. Ad inserted. By the way, for those who don't know, if you're ever doing a live on YouTube and it starts flashing yellow and all sorts of things with you, try pressing the advert button. You'll be amazed at what might happen next. Now, the thing is, these ships are helpful. These ships allow you to react around the world. And for the Royal Navy, at a similar time, they can combine them, can't they? They can combine them because they can add in 3 fast carriers. So suddenly, you could possibly make give the Royal Navy a flying squadron, couldn't you? Each made up of 3 fast capital ships. You know, 6 fast, each made up of, well, 3 fast carriers, 6 fast capital ships. That force would be your response force around the world. That's your 9-ship force. Add in a squadron of cruisers. And you can have 3 response forces. Usually you respond with at least a force built around at least 1 to 2 carriers and 2 to 4 capital ships to any problem. And if we consider the Italians and the French are only allowed 6 capital ships, your fast squadron is actually stronger than the Italian and French navies. And this decision also has an impact on the Queen Elizabeth class. It also has an impact on other ships as well. It's going to have an impact on how you use these carriers. It's going to have an impact on how they develop. Considering the Royal Navy goes down a task force route quite early on, what I could see is, honestly, the reaction, flying squadron, fast squadron, squadron evolution route gone down, and literally them forming a fleet around these fast ships. Probably in about 1930, almost analogous with the appointment of a rear admiral aircraft carriers. There would probably also be a vice admiral flying squadron, rear admiral who would be sitting in the battleships, probably another rear admiral in the battleships, and rear admiral aircraft carriers. They'd each have divisions of roughly 3 ships, so there'd be 9 ships in the force, and they'd sort of work out how they deploy. Might even end up with a 2nd vice admiral there and a 3rd rear admiral. Just to structure it all. And the thing is, if you have these ships going around doing the world presence, that takes the pressure off the rest of the Royal Navy. Again, this is the problems. Because Nelson and Rodney were built as they were, as bulwarks, they are still very good ships, do not get me wrong, but they're built as bulwarks. They can't do, they go to the Mediterranean, they do stuff in it, but they can only be in limited places. They can't do world cruises. They can't do the things the Royal Navy depends on for its presence around the Empire, its presence around the world. These designs can do that. They can do that. And then, if you've got this flexible squadron, which again comes from standard Royal Navy doctrine, Royal Navy history, of having such a squadron, of going around the world, and was actually something which was part of what Jellicoe was proposing and others were considering and proposing at the end of World War I, you suddenly have this as your diplomatic asset, your presence in the Far East, your presence in Europe, your presence in the Mediterranean, wherever you need it, you can have these ships turning up. And you rely on the other ships in the force for doing the local presence, which allows the Queen Elizabeths and the R's to be better husbanded, to be better cared for in the 1920s and 30s. Now, all those people talking about the King George V, remember, we haven't even got out of 1930 yet. So before we get anywhere near that discussion, there's a whole lot of stuff we need to get into. So this is why I'm avoiding those questions like the plague at the moment. I'm just avoiding them. This happens every time we do an alternate history. People want to jump ahead 20, 30 years. We haven't got even out the 1930s yet. In 1930 yet. We're just about there into 1930. We're a long way off. We've first got to deal with the First London Treaty before we get anywhere near the King George V, let alone the Second London Treaty or anything else that comes after it. So the thing is, you're going to have had this presence going around the world. And how does the Royal Navy use it? As said, there's a very high likelihood, the Royal Navy goes the flying squadron route. There's a very high likelihood they're using these far ships to wander around the world. They're doing these regular tours. They're doing these things. They might even... This is the interesting thing. If you do a tour in 1930, 1929, 1930, you might take an aircraft carrier with you. It might not just be Nelson and Rodney doing the tour, their F3s. It might be Courageous or Glorious with them. Because they're the biggest, best carriers the Royal Navy has at the time. And as Stanley's thrown out, naval strategy is build strategy. What is built is what is the effect? Yeah, it is. And so, as I said, you add in some cruisers. Probably going to be counties. Now, the interesting question is, of course, if you built the F3s like the Nelson Rodney like this with F3s and now are part of the global view, do you go for a now F3 style design for your cruisers rather than a Queen Elizabeth / Hood style design for your cruisers? Because if you look at the layout and shaping of a county class, what they look like at distance, they do look like the classic British battleship, Queen Elizabeth, R class, Hood, that sort of shaping. They do look like that, but do you go with this other form? I'm not sure. I am tempted to say that the Surreys might be. The Surreys might go to that sort of form, and the reason is because that's a halfway point between getting the cut price counties, aka Exeter and York, which, as much as I love the individual ships, I hate the idea of, because they do not work. It's the idea of we can save money by cutting all these capabilities, and it ends up costing more, and frankly we end up spending almost as much as we do on the full price of counties, and we don't have something which is as capable as the others. Maybe with the Surreys they go in F3 style, and maybe that means they get more of the Surrey class. If you got them, and remember the Royal Navy was in the process of ordering them when they are cancelled. They've got Surrey, Northumberland, and at least the third one's supposed to be ordered. if you maybe had managed, if they'd gone through F3 style and they'd managed to order all 5 of them, maybe order them slightly earlier because they're less of a fight over it. Let's say they could have been laid down 1920, probably 1928. You might well have had them in service by 1930, by London Naval Treaty. In which case, the Royal Navy would have probably they would have had, instead of they'd have had the Hawkins class, instead of the 2 Yorks, though, they would have had roughly 18 counties in service. Although the Surreys would probably not be called counties, they would probably still be county class names, but they would be called the Surrey class if they go that route. Now, the thing is, you have to keep everything else the same. So we haven't messed with the treaty, we haven't changed the replacement schedules or anything like that. But we have to now think about it before we get to the London Treaty. What is the experience going to be of the other powers? Now, you have to remember, one of the things the Royal Navy did was when they were looking at their 16-inch gun ships to design what they wanted for Nelson and Rodney, was work out, well, how much faster do we need to make them be? And there was a decision that the Nagato class of 26.5 knots were not really a threat to the battle cruisers of the Royal Navy because of the speed they could do. It was felt even Tiger could handle herself to an extent against them by just getting away from them. Probably engaging forced draft and going a lot faster than 28 knots. Yes, Steve, the Surrey class I was talking about would be an F3 style 8-inch cruiser. So they'd have the 8-inch guns forward and the heavy AA aft. And the Colorado class, 21 knots. So, well, let's be honest, even the official speed of 23 knots of the Nelrods gives them a handy advantage in a fight versus them, in terms of being able to dictate range and angle of attack. And the fact is, they also have 9 guns to their 8. So they have 1 more barrel. Not really enough in reality to actually make a major difference in a fight. Not enough. But Stafford, I'm not getting into those kind of questions at the moment, because tonight I've got enough. I'm dealing with enough of alternate history without adding in all the other different variants and designs. And once I answer one what if extra on another design, I'll be getting oodles and oodles of them, and I've already shut down Poor Knight at least twice, so it's unfair of me to then answer yours. So I'm just saying no. Enjoy bowling, Dave Harrison. So basically, this is what the Royal Navy's looking at when they're comparing. Now, I think how the Americans and the Japanese react. Well, the Americans are kind of more easy to predict. For the Americans, they go, we have 16-inch guns, they only have 15-inch. Yeah, that's a win. And that's probably got the politicians happy, because they're just going to look at the top rate of the gun caliber, gun size, and think that's enough. The US Navy, though, is probably going to be bricking it and spending the next 10 years panicking. Or rather, the period between 1927 and 1930 panicking. Because they're going to look at it and going to go, the Royal Navy now has this. This battle line. They can all do at least 28 knots, right? The value of HMS Tiger is nil. No worry in here, this thing. The point is, the Royal Navy now has a solid 6 ships which can go 28 knots. Which means they can all do 7 knots faster than the American battle line. They can all do faster. Now, you and I would both go, probably, well, aircraft carriers, you know? The thing is, the aircraft carrier might be the coming weapon system, but it's not the arrived weapon system at this point, is it? That's another point. I've had a few comments recently from certain people on Twitter who seem to not understand this. That the aircraft carrier might have been the coming weapon system, and during World War II it suddenly developed into a very good and capable weapon system. But it hadn't yet arrived. And if you look at the aircraft available in 1930 and the quality of what they have, That ain't it. So whilst they have a capability, they are a capability, the thing you're still worrying about is your battle line speed and engagement. And so the thing is, the Americans are going to be worried about that. Their battle line is 21 knots. The British battle line, even the R's can do faster than that, and the Queen Elizabeth certainly can. And then you've got this, you've got a corps of 6 who can all outpace that battle line by 7 knots if they wish to. Well, they can just laugh at you the whole time. And there'll be at least 2 ships in that battle line, in that 6, who, if they get in a standing fight with you, are not exactly bad off versus you. Because, let's be honest, the Colorado class, they're good ships. They are good ships. But their armor belt might be 16 inches in places, but in others it's 8 inches. And they might have 16-inch 45 guns. But yeah, the 15-inch 50 is not a bad gun. And the thing is, the Americans gave up the Lexingtons, they gave up all their fast ships at the Washington Naval Treaty. They have some fast aircraft carriers. But are they going to place their faith in them? And then we've got the Japanese. Now, the Americans, as I said, are going to be, to my mind, will be worried about the US Navy will be worried about the speed of the British battle line. But what they're really going to be worried about is the Japanese, because the Japanese Nagato class is 26.5 knots. Well, they're going to be, the Japanese are going to still feel that their battle line's not fast enough, because, let's be honest, there's a 2 knots of speed advantage, at least, for pretty much most of those ships. And there is the fact that the lovely Congo class, as beautiful as they are very much battle cruisers, although, as I said, 2 of them have a sort of transition event, to my mind, and become fast battleships. Their top speed is, as built, is 27.5 knots, so would have been slower than all these ships. As modernised and upgraded, get to 30.5 knots, which is great. But you've still got Nagatos at 26.5. So yeah, are you going to rely on the Congos being able to beat back this force? Well, one-on-one, they should be able to take out Tiger. One-on-one with Nelson and Rodney. Nelson and Rodney, which, again, and Tiger, all these ships, which these are not their speeds on the forced draft, remember? So if they turn on their forced draft and are prepared to slightly wreck their turbines, your speed advantage could disappear. Because the Japanese do measure their speed with forced draft included. Something to remember. Mainly because the Japanese are always seeking to try and up their speed as a deterrence factor, so they like to show off their maximum speed as a deterrent factor, which is why they state it. Yeah, that's not really a good run for your Congos, is it? That's Renowned Repulse, they might have a chance of. Hood, probably not. So there are 3 ships there which they would not have a chance of one-on-one, and there are 6 of these ships, and there are 4 of yours. So even if you have all 4 available, you're not going to have a decisive numerical advantage over them. And if you slow down so Nagato can get involved, that's just going to give them a tremendous speed advantage. And yes, Stalin, the British did know all about the Congos. One of the reasons why the Japanese do quite such drastic rebuilds is because the British know all about the Congos. Yeah. So this for the Japanese is also a problem. The Royal Navy battle line is fast, and as said, whilst they are not fast battleships, They are probably the first ever iterations of Britain's famous fully armoured battlecruiser, which is one step removed from a fast battleship. It's a bad time for them. It's a bad time for them. So, this leads to a problem as we approach the London Naval Treaty, but it can get worse. It can get worse because there are other powers involved. Now, you have to remember, what do the French historically do to earn their place as Britain's ally, to make themselves indispensable from a naval perspective from Britain? They build the Dunkirks. They build a pair of fast battleships. Why? Quite literally, so they can make themselves advantageous to Britain, because Britain is short of fast battleships. If Nelson Rodney are fast battleships now, what do the French do? If they still build the Dunkirks, that's great. You have an extra 2 to slot into the Allied rotation. That's brilliant. They're not going to be upset about that, but... Are you after him? You might want to take his collar off him. He's not going to be happy with you.
Well, Mum wants it off.
Okay.
She thinks he's going to get too hot.
He's not too hot. He's having a lovely time.
Oh, she thinks he's going to get too hot. It's alright, you carry on. I'll get it off.
Okay. Sisters, mothers, everyone worrying. You were enjoying yourself, weren't you? You like your things. So, the whole point is... Yeah. Are you sure you don't want me to get it off for you?
No, it's fine.
I just feel it would be quicker and less embarrassing.
It's fine. What's wrong with my corgi t-shirt?
There's nothing wrong with your corgi
What's wrong with my
t-shirt.
corgi t-shirt?
Nothing
I
wrong.
like my corgi t-shirt.
Let's put the ring back on you so you have it on. He likes it on.
Yeah,
You do realise he's going to spend the next half hour complaining about this.
Good luck.
Compensation. We'll do compensation. Sorry, everyone, for that interruption. So that's elder sister. Now, the thing is, the Bretagne class are their previous editions prior to the Dunkirks, and yes, the Dunkirks would still be useful as. No, I don't. How you all psychically managed to get that, to deliver that to him, I do not know. But okay, we'll leave that. You go there. No, you're not getting a whole bag of biscuits. But the trouble is, that's, you know, in terms of when they're traditionally delivered, the Royal Navy has down to 3 battle cruisers. As we're planning on delivering them, even if they come later, the Royal Navy will be down to 5 fast ships. So it'll still be useful. Because it'll take them from 5 to... It'll mean the Allies have 7 rather than 5. But it's not as essential. They're not going to be as essential to the Alliance and to the capabilities of the Force. But they are going to be still building up on the Force. Now, what about the Andreadorias? The Italians and the Bretagnes of the French, the Protestants. Well, the thing is, for the French, their 20-knot ships with 13.4-inch fortified guns really start to look like a problem in this period. Really start to look like a problem. They start, you know, the fact is, for the French, those battleships were part of a necessary build, but the Washington Treaty has truly scuppered their chances of getting their decent designs into service. The Andreadoria class, now, historically, the Andreadoria class go for a bit of a midlife upgrade. They really do. They go into being converted into fast battleships, as far as some people like to call them. I don't call them fast battleships. Why? Because their top speed is 26 knots. And to be a fast battleship, you need a speed of 28 knots or higher. But we'll leave that to one side, because you need to be able to keep up the cruiser line. And the Italian cruiser line is definitely not a 26 knot cruiser line. But no, they tend to try and call them fast battleships with 26 knot speed. The thing is, if the fastest you can get them up to is 26 knots, and their armor belt is still 9.8-inch guns, and they are armed with still 12.4-inch guns, they're just begging for the attention of something like Nelson and Rodney in this form. The F3s will be fast enough to hunt them down, whatever condition they're in. It doesn't matter if they're 21-knot ships or 26-knot ships. They're going to end up getting hunted down by an F3 in a battle line, and it's just going to go, "Hello! I have more guns than you." Or rather, I have... no, they're supposed to say I have one less gun. Actually, no, I have one less gun than you, but I have a bigger broadside than you, and I am a lot meaner than you. Honestly, they are better off building new ships. Them and the French are all better off building new ships completely. They are better. They do have options in designs. They are better off building new ships. Now, the thing is, if they build new ships and they are 28-knot ships, that's going to cause a trouble. That is going to cause problems. And this is really the reality they have to face. For both France and Italy, there is going to be a severe temptation in this scenario to build something faster and better than they have. I don't think the French will do it because of economics. I think the Italians will honestly consider, because you have to remember, they managed to upgrade 4 ships. But realistically, how many could they build for the same price? Same value. Hey, Drac. It's just... for the this sort of scenario, if you have these ships built... And as said, they are pretty much early versions of the fully armored battlecruiser concept. I think for the Italians, I think they honestly will probably build something new, mainly because of Mussolini's ego, and because the British having that is going to be close enough that he's going to be going, "I want something which does 28 knots as well," at least. And he can't get 28 knots out of those hulls. You cannot get 28 knots out of this hull. No matter how much... No, you can't. Sorry, for the cost of trying to get 28 knots into shell, because I was just mentally going, well, you could if you dropped it down to 8 guns in 4 twin turrets, and you could potentially, but no. It's easier to build a new ship than it is to get 28 knots. Now, you might still carry on as it did historically, but the thing is, there's a good reason not to. It's a really good reason not to at this point. So this leads us to the point where things get really interesting, and the point where we start to get into the changes which could happen. You see, historically, the London Naval Treaty, in terms of what it mandates for, as applies to battleships and capital ships, it basically goes, the Washington Treaty is still in force, and this. They defined a tonnage of a standard displacement. That's historically what happens, because so much of the world has stayed the same. Now, the thing is, as said, the Nelrods are pretty much the ultimate dreadnought battleship. They are the ultimate historic dreadnought battleship, and that's what they're doing. So, realistically, this is a problem. This will probably have to change. And that's where we get into what will be probably a topic of discussion for about the next half an hour. This. And it's really going to be this slide as well, because I put in North Carolina because I thought, frankly, nothing illustrates this more better. Because if the USN and IGN are really worried, and I think they would be, I think it's the only way to fix that worry is to do construction. You cannot argue for the British to suddenly get rid of their ships. They're not going to. That's not on the cards for the First London Naval Treaty. Yes, you're getting rid of the old 13.5-inch gun ships. Yes, we're getting rid of the older ships. But no one is really doing much else. And so that means if they're not worried, then everything carries on as it does historically. And you just end up with a World War II where, honestly, there's going to be an argument of whether the King George V's have 15-inch guns and are probably 9 15-inch guns as well, and it's the Royal Navy's all got standardized on a 15-inch gun. Probably. But the thing is, I'd argue, and I hope I've made a good case of this, that I don't think the Americans or Japanese are going to be happy with this scenario. They're not going to be happy with the speed disadvantage of their battle line. They're not going to be happy with what's happened. I think there's going to be enough dissatisfaction built up in the intervening 8 years that there's going to need to be changes. And I think the easiest change they're going to do is, let's say we have an agreement for 5 years or 6 years. I've put 6 years because it had to be done by 1936. Technically, it's supposed to be 1935, but 36 is technically when it was supposed to be done by. So in the 6-year period, Britain would have to be allowed to build, America would have to be allowed to build the same number of ships. Both would have to build about 5, Japan 3, and France and Italy 2 ships. Now, here's your problem. Because if you're starting this in 1930 and you're the Royal Navy, who literally just had Nelson Rodney enter service in 1927, you've only had a 3-year gap in building of battleships. You've got 15-inch gun fast battleships, 28 knots. You are probably going to have some ideas about what you want to do to these designs. These are not fast battleships, they are fully armed battlecruisers. But you can probably now because of the power density you can now get from engines, you can probably increase their subdivision and make them produce a design of roughly fast battleships with a speed of 28 knots. So again, you're probably still going to lose Tiger. And you're probably going to lose all those 13.5-inch ships. You might well be losing some of the older Rs. Some of the R class. Because they've got less room for development. But you can build 5 new ships in this 6-year period. Japan can build 3 new ships. France and Italy have the option to build 2 new ships. And I think this is more likely than ground upgrades. I think it's kind of a measured construction. Now, the interesting thing for me, if we go down the measured construction route, is I think the USN ends up quickly on something like North Carolina design. I think they really do. Because they've been toying with that idea for quite a while. By the time they reach it. And I think that suits them. I think you might get the Royal Navy build continuation of the Nelrod design. There's this F3 style Nelrod design. They might as well stick with it and build it as their form. Japan's going to be interesting because they might well choose to try and cheat the system and build something which is heavier than 35,000 tons. But there's going to be a limit to it, and they're going to want to stay in the treaty that much longer. But it's also going to give them a chance to build new battleships, build new ships. And what do they choose to replace? Now, I think it could be, honestly, and this is a bit cruel on my part, but I think it's probably going to be the Fuzos and Izes which get replaced. Or at least the 2 Fuzos and one of the Izes. I would argue it's more likely they replaced them with their 23 knot speed than they replaced the Congos on the Congos because they can do more with the Congos. So that's going to be a reality to do it. Now, again, there are going to be things like, as Robert Dennis just brought up, in light of the depression, the USN actually managed to order and procure them without harming other production orders in the time. Yeah, the thing is, if you've got depression, if you've got allowed to them, you're talking about building 5 battleships over a 6-year period. That's not going to harm other construction. It's going to be able to fit in quite well. In fact, in the depression time period, having this construction could actually be advantageous because wages are low. They're depressed by the depression. But also, yards are looking for work. Now, for France and Italy to build 2 ships, remember again, the French have space to build. They build the 2 Dunkirks traditionally. They could actually build 3 sort of slightly bigger, fast battleships. And whilst, yes, they might drop down in design, they might well use that space, because traditionally they do use the space which really, their tonnage, their free tonnage to build the Dunkirks. Because the Dunkirks are, if I'm not mistaken, and I want to be clarified, are 26,500 tons in standard. So they are on the smaller end of the fast battleships. If you're building 3 ships, they could possibly get away with 3 roughly 30,000 ton ships, and that's extra 3,500 tons you can do a lot with in standard. And the point is, if you do this as your policy, if you do this as your structure, you can make it work. You either have the treaty system collapse in 1930, which is an option, or around the negotiations, because they try and introduce speed limitations and all sorts of things which different powers are not going to take, because it's going to be impossible for everyone to work it out and be happy with it. Or you're going to have to, the only way you're going to satisfy the Americans, and because the British aren't going to, if you, let's say, the Americans and Japanese go, there's got to be a speed limit. If you've got a battle, your capital ships can no longer do faster than 28 knots. Well, that's fine for the British, but the British are still going to be annoyed that they have to get rid of 3 battle cruisers. They're not going to accept to get rid of Hood, Renown, and Repulse. They're not going to do that. Unless you let them replace them with 3 new ships, and then they get to replace those ships. And your ships, none of yours other ships are going to be cancelled out because of that speed advantage. Not a single one. So you're just giving the British the chance to build 3 more new ships? That's smart. It's not going to happen. Take care, Drac. Thanks for being here. That's not just not going to happen. So it's what's going to happen is going to be, I'd say, the only option you've got is either you don't do anything and you leave it as historically is, with this being the only thing which applies to battleships in the London Naval Treaty of 1930, or you put in an allowed construction. In which case, the British and the Americans are going to have parity. British aren't going to accept less than parity. So you build them in terms of the scale. You go 5-3 to 5-3-2. And so you go, right, we've got a 6-year agreement. You build 5, British and Americans build 5. Rob Dunant, yes, I think there has been an alternate history on the early collapse of the treaty system in 1930 and ramifications. I'm not sure 100% where it is. But I think there was. I can't remember the title, but I think that I've done one. I can't remember its title, but I'm sure one of the lovely admins in the chat will remember it. And the thing is, again, if they are building these ships, by the way, that then probably becomes the model for the second London Naval Treaty, but also you have the other issue. you have a long-term issue coming out of this, because Japan's historic gripe and the real problem they have is they're not allowed to build ships. And they feel it just makes them put them at a permanent disadvantage because their infrastructure vis-a-vis the Americans and the British, because the British and Americans can surge construction, whereas the Japanese don't have the spares to construction to do that. Well, now they get to build some ships. And they can probably lie a bit about it, as said. If you make it a 40,000-ton ship rather than a 35,000-ton ship and knock some inches off the armor, and when you're meeting specifications or things like that, you can probably get away with it. Unless you go and start going visit yards. Or visiting ports, as the Italians did in Gibraltar, and the British went, yeah. And if you weigh the tonnage you claim you do, then my aunt is my uncle. Or rather, my aunt's and a monkey's uncle, I think was the actual phrase. The realistic point of view, therefore, becomes we start having construction in 1930. Now, I think the British keep to 15-inch guns at this point. The reason is, for them, it's worked out quite well, keeping to a 15-inch 50 design. They might want to push up to a 16-inch gun design, but they might well not. The politicians might be happy with a 15-inch gun, and if you keep to the 15-inch 50 design, you've got some options. You've also got options for putting in, that's... The 15-inch 50 is going to mean that your 80 rounds of ammunition are going to be just that bit lighter. Your gun barrels are just that bit lighter. All your handling things and systems are just that bit lighter. And cumulatively, that adds up. The reality is, that makes sense for the British. But I think for the Americans and Japanese, they're going to go with 16-inch guns. Mainly because the Japanese 18-inch gun is not going to get through the treaty system and is going to be spotted. And it's kind of like, starting and providing battleships. The Navy's new. This is going to sound strange, but what happens is, the naval architects of each of the different units, in the Royal Navy, that's the constructors, etc. But the US has their own equivalent and all the things. And they look at the designs of other navies, they look at what they specify, and they do their own maths, and they go, these things don't add up. We can't prove it doesn't add up, but we can tell you it doesn't add up. And very quickly, the navies realise. But the thing is, they were all lying. You've got Lexington and Saratoga, which are apparently 37,000 tons in standard displacement exactly. You have all these things, it's... How do I put this politely? It's the fact is, everyone's lying, but as long as their lying is within the allowed amount of lying, they're okay. The thing is, the rules of the treaty are more about keeping everyone within a certain band than necessarily keeping them exactly on line. They know they're not going to. The British are some of the most prolific at it, because the British have water for armour, which they include in their ships, and of course, water doesn't count towards the standard displacement, and all sorts of things are worked out in the British in the designs which are in favour of the British. The thing is, the British help write a lot of the letter of the rules, so they very rarely keep within the spirit of the rules. Others break the letter of the rules, but are trying to keep within the spirit. It's the whole fun of the treaties, okay? I have done a whole video which was basically going through everyone's lies during the naval treaties. Every single nation's lying. And I think it came out the only ones who were honest the whole way through were the French. And even they weren't always honest, because some of their things are actually they made mistakes in their own calculations. So the thing becomes, again, they're building these ships. That then presents a problem, I would argue, for the non-constructing navies in the world. And it does create a problem for the non-constructing navies. Because one of the reasons why the Soviet Union holds off its construction when it does, when it's looking at Project 21 and other projects in the early 1930s, is because others aren't building battleships. So they can afford to hold them off because the treaties are stopping them building, so they can take their time for their status, etc., and keep to the gangers. But Stalin is neurotic and annoyed enough with the world that if now it's been announced that Britain's going to build a class of 5 new ships, and this will be the King George V class, but it'll be the King George V class because that's the next name to come up in the list of battleship designs. If that's built in 1930. Or 1930 onwards. Let's say they're laid down in 1931. You're laying down 2 in 1931, 2 in 1933, and 1 in 1935 to finish them all off by 1936 or something like that. Or you might even lay them all down more quickly than that. Build them across different yards. It's going to be up to the British navies how they do it. That's going to mean you're having 5 new ships coming in. So for the Royal Navy, that's going to replace. Well, Tiger's gone, which is historically treated, but she's probably going to be kept around instead of Iron Duke as the gunnery training ship. Especially she'll cover other ships going whilst they're coming out of refit, etc. So she's going to be probably kept around for that because she fits more with this faster fleet. So these 5 ships, they're probably what will they replace if you're keeping the historic numbers? Probably they're going to replace the R's. So all the R's are probably going to go, as historically. But that means the Royal Navy will then have 7 ships which do 28.5 knots, probably 20.5 knots in service. That'll be the new 5 King George V's with their 9 15-inch guns. Nelson and Rodney. Probably they'll have the 3 32-knot ships. And that's going to be 8 of their ships in their formation. And then they're going to have the Queen Elizabeths. Which takes it up to 13 ships. They might even keep... they would probably keep Tiger around for a bit longer. So, yeah, nice way, because they're allowed 15 ships. Under a treaty limitation. So there are 5 Queen Elizabeths, 5 R's, and the other 5. So that's 15. So yeah, you'd have 3 of them plus those 2. Oh yeah, so that's 7 plus 3, so that's 10 those ships, and then the 5 Queen Elizabeths would be the slowest ships in the fleet. The interesting thing is going to be what happens to the Queen Elizabeth upgrades. Because the RN might start the Queen Elizabeth upgrades at the same time, because especially if you're doing a construction program, that's going to reduce the cost of doing the upgrades on the Queen Elizabeths, right? And that means you run the R's to keep them to basically you run the R's ragged while you're replacing them. If you know you're going to replace the R's, you might as well run them ragged in the meantime. So take the Queen Elizabeth in for upgrade. And if you're building 5 new ships at the same time, you can do some upgrades to the Queen Elizabeths, and that might mean it might be worth it to try and push the Queen Elizabeths up to 28-knot ships. So you consider the advantages for the Royal Navy if they make the Queen Elizabeth's 28-knot ships, is that then gives them an entire fleet is all 28 knots plus. And that fleet that's a battle line which is, the Royal Navy's battle line now is a 28-knot battle line. And it might be a case of, okay, we can only do the Queen Elizabeth will only do this under forced conditions, even if we upgrade the boilers and the turbines and the shafts. But it might also be a case of we can do this with the new boilers and new turbines and new shafts. It's going to be entirely out. They've got 4 shafts to spread the load over, so they should be able to do it. For the Americans, what would they, if they build 5 ships, what are they going to replace? Well, I would say it's going to replace the earliest of the standards. It's going to replace the earliest of the standards. which is going to change things, and interestingly enough, for World War II. Because if we think about it, the standards, if Nevada class, the Pennsylvanias, and probably I'm tempted to say Idaho BB-42 rather than New Mexico of the New Mexico class. If they're all replaced in the early 1930s, you have with 28 knot ships, with North Carolina style ships, then you have an advantage coming in. Yes, they've got the 16-inch 45s, but yes, with 28 knots, they're going to be good ships. They're going to be a very good battle line for the US Navy to work from. And they're going to change their approach to things, because suddenly you've got some fast ships to work with your carrier forces. Earlier in the 1930s, which might see them testing out that doctrine a lot earlier. Might even see them going the same route down as the Royal Navy, which could change quite a lot of their plans. It also might give them a reason to get more fast oilers into service more quickly. Because for both the Royal Navy and the US Navy at that point, the oilers are going to be the main speed limitation on their fleet. And whilst the Royal Navy has, of course, a different infrastructure and geographical setup than the Americans, in that they have a chain of bases the whole way around the world they can draw their fuel from. And so their oilers, they need a whole bunch of slow oilers to move the fuel between those bases. And fast oilers only have to go to the nearest base and then get to the fleet. And so that's how they operate in revolts. They don't have to cross an entire ocean like the Americans do. Because for a long time there is enough fuel at Hawaii for the fast oilers to go to there. So the fast oilers literally have to go to San Francisco and come back to operate and support their fleets. The thing is, they could do that. New Mexico's, well, I said Nevadas and Pennsylvanias would go, but also there are 5 replacements, and there's only 2 Nevadas and 2 Pennsylvanias. So I would say possibly, and there are the ships which are before them. You know, I do realise there's New York class, etc. But yeah, so but I don't want to. I don't want to advocate anything which involves getting rid of it. USS Texas. She's still around. She might come and hurt me. So I'm going to pretend that doesn't happen. You can all, if you want to suggest getting rid of Texas, that's on you. But I was just going for the standards. Because I don't want Texas to hunt me down and hurt me. But probably you would be talking about the Wyoming and New Yorks. Going. Probably the Wyomings and New Yorks. But, yeah, I'm going to say the standards because Texas might track me down. Okay? Not only I have a healthy respect for USS Texas and her ability to track me down across the Atlantic Ocean. Basically, I'm leaving the New Yorks and the New Yorks and the Wyomings alone because of. And some people I do know have caught the Arkansas, but it's technically the Wyomings because Wyoming's BB-32. Yeah. Stafford, do you really want to bet against USS Texas? Do you really? You say you might. You don't think she'll make it across the Atlantic. Do you really want to make that bet, though? It's kind of like the bet of HMS Warspite versus the Yamato. On paper, I know Yamato class wins that fight, but I still don't want to bet against the machine spirit of Warspite. But yeah, so I reckon yeah, it probably is, but please, I'm gonna say it's the Wyomings and the New Yorks, other than Texas. Texas, of course, stays because Texas is Texas. Or maybe their new class is named the Texas class. And the Machine Spirit is transferred to a new one. I don't know. But basically, they're going to get 5 ships along the lines of the North Carolinas. Darius Radsky, she doesn't need to. I live close enough to the coast that she doesn't need to flood to hit me. Now, the reason it would be the 16-inch 45 is because that's the gun they're developing at the time. They might have gone. Let me put it this way, Michael Coach. For the Americans to get a new gun like the 1650 takes a long time to get funding through, and there's the Two Ocean Navy Act and various things which fund the research which develops into it. So whilst I would love to say that gun would take place, that's also going to delay the construction. There's a reason why the North Carolinas, which you have to remember, are built in... checking up the exact dates. They're laid down in 37 and are launched in 1940 and commissioned in April 1941 in the case of North Carolina. They are armed with 16-inch 45s because the 16-inch 50 is not available yet. So I would say it's going to be anything, it'll be the 16-inch 45. Especially as these ships are going to be built from about, as I said, 1931 onwards. Bug Guy, didn't they already have the 16-inch 50s for the Lexington and South Dakotas? Not the 1650, which was later used. And it's one of those things of, it's the latest metallurgy, it's the latest development of gun. The Colorados had 16-inch 45s, and so they really hadn't got a 16-inch 50 available. Oh, Rob Dennett, if you want to look up a good example of that, there's Warspite's name occasionally skips a generation, but very rarely does. There's HMS Dreadnought's name, and the US don't really name ships enough the same way. Honestly, they don't really name enough ships to follow that on with the same names. They don't really get in the same level of historical naming as the Royal Navy does. We'll see. Well, maybe the Constellation class frigates will give us a clue on that one. But no, the French Navy have a couple which are interesting. But yeah, basically the Royal Navy is the best example because they're the ones who historically like to reuse the names the most often. So far, of any navy at current times. Spanish also quite like to reuse names, but they tend to reuse names of admirals who, how do I put it slightly, lost to British admirals. So yeah, I think you have a good few ships being developed. I'd say you'd have some Super Dunga. The interesting one to me is going to be the Italians, because they couldn't really build a Littorio-style ship in this time period, but that's probably what they'd want. It is going to be interesting what they build. It is going to give them 2 very interesting ships. Again, I wouldn't be surprised if they cheat quite a bit. The Littorios, you have to remember, were officially laid down anyway in 1934. So, with Littorio and Vittorio Veneto both being laid down in 1934. So I have this feeling that, as that fits with this timeline, I wouldn't be surprised if you saw a Littorio-style ship, pretty much, being the option they pursue, with 9 15-inch guns. So I think probably the Italians, the British are both going 15-inch. The French will probably go 13.4 or something like that. They're just there's a limit to what they can do. They might go pure 13-inch guns. They might go pure 13-inch guns, and in this way they might go for 3 quadruple turrets. They might if you go for a 30,000-ton standard design with their tonnage limitations and advantages, with the ability to build 2 new ships anyway to place some older ships, they might actually be able to get. Because if you're historically building up to 35,000 tons, that's 70,000 tons. And if you've got 53,000 tons, so that's 123,000 tons. You could build 4 30,000-ton ships, so that the French could build 4 30,000-ton ships, which I think could just about get them the speed they want of 29 knots, and 12 13-inch guns. Now, if they do have 12 13-inch guns, that's going to be an interesting design. That's going to be the biggest guns they can build. No, that's Rob. That's what I'm literally referring to earlier in the answer to the question. You asked me about the machine spirit not transferring with the name, but yeah, look up this on the history of HMS Warspite. They're about most of the name transfers, but in terms of HMS Dreadnought, yeah. The name really doesn't transfer. And Prince of Wales also another good one. Some of those have been very good ships. Some of those have been terribly bad luck ships. Current iteration, if it follows form, should be quite a good lucky ship. Yeah, but the thing is, Knight, what I'm talking about is when you've got 2 ships which have had the same name, that can't really give you a clue as to whether or not the machine spirit transfers on with the name. Once you have 7 or 8 ships which have had the same name, or 9 or 10 ships which have had the same name, that's the scenario we're talking about. That's the point at which you can start to pick up with the names, bring anything with them. So yeah, the Italians will be a Littorio. Now I do think this is also going to have effect on carrier construction, because if you've got this through on battleships, you're going to have some carriers being constructed as well, and that could change things. This is the period, remember, when the Royal Navy does order HMS Ark Royal historically, and the Americans have the Yorktowns and various other things get ordered. So I wouldn't be surprised if you see those orders historically, but maybe more of them. There also might be a desire to change the numbers. If the Royal Navy's been operating with a fast carrier force and are getting really focused on their task groups, the Royal Navy might go, well, we don't see the need for this construction, but if you do, we'd also like to see XY on the aircraft carriers, because I do realise by this point there are a lot of admirals like Henderson and Field, as well as one who I talked about earlier, but who already by this point is doing quite a lot of work on carriers. So it's Alexander and Blackhouse, etc. They're all pushing for carriers. Nice to get everyone. That's interesting. I think Ship Girls in many ways are a cartoonish take on the topic. But that's not a bad thing. That's something for people that a lot of people can find enjoyable and enjoy representing. However, for me, machine spirit comes across as it's something I use as shorthand for a different thing. I think certain names attract a certain culture within a crew. I've talked about this a lot before in the class of ships. When we talk about ships, there's a reason why the Traveller class destroyers crews behave as they are. The Royal Navy destroyer crews already believed they were an elite. Okay, they always believed they were an elite. And the tribals are basically believe they're an elite of an elite. They believe they're there to protect the rest of the destroyers. They're there to lead the rest of the destroyers into a fight. And that's partially down to their names. They've chosen tribes which have martial history and martial value and martial honour. And they make sure they understand that. And it's similar for crews if they hear they're assigned to something called HMS Warspite, or HMS Dreadnought, or HMS Ark Royal, or USS Enterprise. That is a name which sends a vision through the crew, and they expect certain things of themselves. And this, when it's combined with generations of a crews living and breathing in this name, I think it builds something on itself. You know, some people walk into churches and cathedrals and they are completely not moved in other ways, in any way. But others walk in and they feel the spirits around them, they feel the atmosphere. Well, for me, while that's not been often the case, I have walked aboard ships, especially historic ones, and you can feel that this was a ship which was, and you have to remember, warship is not just the place they fight from, it's where they live and die, it's where they live, it's where they sleep, it's their home, it's their safe place, it's their weapon, it's everything for them. It means so much to them, and that I feel does create something. And yeah, as standard, Enterprise sailors will fight you if you disrespect their name, yeah. And if you disrespected any of their ship's names, they mean something to you. Invincible wasn't quite the same, but Illustrious, the crew aboard HMS Illustrious, I can tell you just from personal experience, having visited her when she was in service, they took their history seriously. Taranto Night was special aboard HMS Illustrious, but they took their history seriously. They really did. So, and the reason why I can get to the London Treaty and I can't get any further is because, as I said, my strong suspicion is London Treaty leases construction. And that's going to change things. That's going to bring in these whole new ships. But I also think there are going to be people like Stalin looking on who are going to go, I have to build ships. I have to build something. And I won't be surprised if the Project 21s get built. I would not be surprised if the Project 21s get built. They are the earliest ones designs. Their design comes, usually put it down in 1935, but there are earlier discussions of it in 1933, and that's the time period. And again, if they order these ships in that period, they might even have some in service by 1939. If they order them in 1933, 6 years later, they could have something in service in 1939. And the thing is, that's going to change a lot of history. You see, building the Deutschlands makes sense in a world where the only free ships which can really hunt you down and kill you with impunity are Hood, Renown, and Repulse. But if we consider the Deutschland class, well, as good a cruisers as they are, and they are cruisers, heavy cruisers, their top speed's 28 knots. If you now have 7 ships in the Royal Navy which can all do 28.5 knot ships before forced draft, and remember, the diesel vessels, if you do forced draft with diesel, that doesn't help them. Steam boilers, it helps them. That means there's a lot of ships which can now hunt you down. There's a lot of ships which can hunt you down. That's going to change the metric of construction for the Deutschland class. I know historically they start off in being built in 1929, but let's be honest, you order the next 3. And yes, they're for the Baltic. You can argue and then to replace these ships, and they have value in that role and they can be built to that role. But if the Soviets are building this, Germany's in real trouble. And Italy's even further ahead than they were historically. Japan's building ships. The interesting question is going to be, what does the next treaty do? If the next treaty is a continuation of the first London Treaty, and it's a case of, right then, we've got 6 years, we can all build these ships. Again, you can build, over the next 6 years, you can build another 5, Britain and America can build another 5, and all these things. So to say, get on 1942. Does that make a difference? does Japan feel slightly more confident with having those three new capital ships? I don't know. Do they still break off the treaty system? They might do. They're going to be in a slightly better place to do it. They're going to have better ships as a base and on. But the thing is, so are Britain, so is America. And they're going to have 5 new ships. And the thing is, the historical problems, you have the King George V's, where you have a shortage of armour production, all these things which delay their construction. That's not going to happen now. If the Royal Navy needs to build more ships in the next period from 1936-37 onwards, all those kinks have been worked out in the earlier 1930s. All those problems have been worked out. It had to be. And they probably do keep the 9 15-inch gun 19 15-inch guns. Now the question is, do they go for an all-forward arrangement still? Do they go for a King George V style of 2 turrets forward, one turret aft? So, yeah. It's going to be an interesting question to see what happens. But does this affect the likely timeline for World War II? I don't think so, but it could force the Germans... Probably won't, because the Germans will still be thinking they can develop a balanced fleet. The interesting question is, do the British accept the Anglo-German Naval Treaty? The British may or may not. They're going to feel far more confident. For the British, they're going to be that much further along in their rearmament before war has even begun. Because you think about it, there's rearmament when you're worried you've got no new battleships and haven't had any for ages. And there's rearmament when you go, well, we've got now 2 fully armoured battle cruisers and 5 fast battleships, all which have a speed of 28.5 knots in service. We have Rodney, Renown, and Repulse, who've all been gone through various cycles of upgrade, and Queen Elizabeth, all gone through cycles of upgrade, and we've upgraded all their speeds. Suddenly, that's a different criteria, Britain. That's a different facility Britain's feeling. And this is one of the things you always have to think about when you're doing deterrence, okay? Deterrence as a mission, especially conventional deterrence, but strategic deterrence as well. Conventional deterrence is as much about confidence of you as it is about your opponent. It's how you project yourself, how you feel about yourself. And that will affect what you're willing to agree to and what kind of positions. Because if you are talking about a Royal Navy which has built the destroyers it needed to do and done all these things because it's been building these, it's in a very different position, and the government is in a very different position psychologically than a Navy which hasn't got these things behind it. Could be a very problematic thing for the Germans to think through. Now, I think Hitler being Hitler and the fascist dictators being the fascist dictators and all dictators being the dictators they are. The one example who's a bit different is Franco, but not much different. He was looking at other battleships, but you know, the one dictator who hasn't been worried about how big he looks on the world stage and what is the substitute for how big he looks on the world stage does seem to be pretty much Franco. I cannot see... I think Hitler still tries to get some battleships built. The thing is, though, if Stalin's already building these, then that's also going to have an impact on the Japanese. The Japanese are going to go, we need more battleships because Russia's building battleships. And it's one thing about the Ganguts, but have you seen the official stats of these ships? And yes, you know, the people going around, oh, they're going to be Soviet ships. They're not going to be as good as they're making out. You can't afford to rely because they might turn out to be as good. So the Japanese are going to have a legitimate argument to come to the treaty and go, we need to build more ships. And if they need to build more ships to deal with the Soviets, then the British and the Americans will be building more ships to deal with them. So let's say they go, okay, fine, well, Japan, you can up your fleet to 12 ships. Great. That means Britain and America can up their fleet to 20 ships. And so instead of the 1937 build replacing the Queen Elizabeth class, they're probably going to be an addition to them. And that's just going to be a nightmare. Because, for the Germans especially, because if they ordered them in 1936, because the treaty sort of agreed that period, and these would all be under construction, then you'll be looking at the center of the Royal Navy will be getting to 20 capital ships well before that. The Italians can go to 8 ships, the French can go to 8 ships, all these things will ripple down, and they'll already have construction in process. They'll have already got some of their construction sorted out, and their issues sorted out, before the traditional build-up time. Thank you. I think someone just joined my... Did someone... Oh, Jacob. Thank you. Thank you for that. They're just going to be going, well, we've built all this up. We've got all this up. What happens? They're all building up, and the Nazis are now starting later. They're going to be... It's going to be a real problem for Germany, what they do. They might try and go the whole submarine route. They might decide to go completely offset strategy. But as I've explained before, the problem with going for an offset strategy in the 1930s, even today, if you go for a one-dimensional threat, that can mean you're very strong, but also means you're very predictable. If the Germans go all submarine, and they're going all submarine from 1937 onwards, and that's what they're focusing on, then you just see the Royal Navy will turn around, get its sloop design off the wall, and you have to remember, sloops are always, you're able to build as many as you want. Sloops are never limited in quantity by treaty. They're limited in size and speed. They're not supposed to be designed for a speed greater than 20 knots. Please note that, designed for speed greater than 20 knots. They go greater than 20 knots, that's not a problem, but they're not supposed to be designed to be faster than 20 knots. And they've got a maximum tonnage of 2,000 tons, and they've got maximum number of guns they can have on them. But they can have as many depth charges as you want. You can have anti-submarine warfare mortars if you develop them on them, and all those things. So, if the Germans go all submarine route from 1937, you're just going to see the Royal Navy turn around and go, design off, build. And we know what they do, because they do it in 1939. They have the design finalised in 1938 for the Flower class, and in 1939 they go, build, and they order them by the 100. And the Australians ordered the Bathurst class, and they also ordered the Hunt class escort destroyers, which, yes, they have a problem with, but partially that's because they are not so much emergency ships, but the point of the discussions, they are in wartime and they're dealing with all sorts of things, and everyone thinks someone lower down the line has corrected them, and that's the mistake that happens. But this would be earlier in peacetime. It would be a couple of years earlier. They just keep doing it. They just do that. And for the Germans, that would mean there'd suddenly be a whole load of Aztec-equipped escorts out there from the beginning of the war. And the Royal Navy's construction can always outbuild their submarines because, please don't take this the wrong way, the person in charge of the German rearmament program is a guy called Hermann Goering. And he's not really positive on funding the Navy. And that's one of the reasons why, at the beginning of World War II, they have so few submarines in service. Because of the funding. Because of how that's been restricted. I'm not sure what the Fluff is up to, but the Fluff is investigating something. Definitely investigating something. And again, you've got Stalin in the background probably building ships. He might not be, he might be. And how are the rest of the world going to react? And again, if the Royal Navy's going up to allowed to have 20 ships, do they forward base some in with the Australians? And, well, that makes sense, wouldn't it? Maybe make them part of the Royal Australian Navy. And would it be the elder Nelson and Rodney? Maybe not. They might get Queen Elizabeth, though. Modernised Queen Elizabeth might be a nice thing for the Australians to get. So the thing is, lots of things are going to change. This is why I'm not getting into World War II. This is why I'm not answering this question, because by that point I am in pure fantasy. I can tell you up to this point, I can tell you the rough ideas of what's going on. But honestly, does World War II end up happening earlier? In terms of the European war, is it two separate wars? That's a strong possibility. Hello. It's bedtime?
Yes.
Do you realise that poodle knows it's bedtime?
Well, he's going in the garden.
Yeah, and then bedtime. He knows it. He knows it. Literally, he knows it. So it's approaching 10:30. It's time for bedtime. Okay.
Did they see them?
They have seen them, yes.
Oh, good.
They have seen them. Hello. You're back? You decided you didn't want bedtime?
Go.
It's gone. Right. By the way, there are Karen treats, Corgi treats, and Poodle treats all being ordered by chat.
Karen treats? I didn't realise people realised what Karen treats were.
Yes, they're putting Katie in the chat. See? Katie stands for Karen treat.
There's not enough Lucas lilt in the world, dear.
I know.
There really isn't.
Furious Gorgian man. No, more like the curious Gorgian man. But yes, that is the joy of the stuff. So KT's Karen treats. I think PT is Poodle treats, and CT is Corgi treats. And yes, I will try and get my sister to discuss sea defense at some point, but we'll see. If that one's going to be slightly more difficult to organize, because my sister doesn't like really doing stuff on camera on terms of YouTube, but she's getting more confident. She's coming in more, mainly because she's kicked in here by Mum. Sorry, that was pool time. How many dry docks does Australia have that can take a Queen Elizabeth by late 30s and so on? There's a couple, actually. There's more actually than there are today. That's the interesting thing. Honestly, in the 1970s, the Australian government has a lovely time filling in a load of dry docks. You might have heard me discuss this in the Bathurst class video, and the in terms of Castlemaine, and in terms of the other video I've done on their frigate program recently, which I really did love doing. On both those, I did discuss the fact that they filled in quite a lot of their how to put it, their dry docks. So you've got frigating in World War II for the Allies with Diamantina and etc. Both of them cover the fact that a lot of their dry docks get filled in this period. If they'd had the battleships in World War II, maybe they'd be different. Now, it's all pretty much interesting. So, with that said, we've reached the portion of the video where I'm going to say questions. Do you have any questions? What are they? And I'm going to do questions for roughly 20 odd minutes. And then I'm going to have a quick bio break, and then I'm going to be on Discord for roughly half an hour. 45 minutes, and then I'm going to check the recording of the Tribals video, which is for tomorrow. And if it's good, it'll be advertised later tonight. If it's not, it'll be re-recorded later tonight. Honestly, Guru Zukov, is this talking to me? Are you forgetting that USA wasn't clear on their policy at that time, post-war one? And one of those, it's only known for this USA would go for a strong relationship to UK. USA was non-allied to anyone post-World War I, 1920s. How do I put this politely? Okay, so America was non-allied European-wise. All right? They didn't want to be involved in a European conflict. But there was a realization from quite early on that in any Eastern conflict, and any conflict in Asia against Japan, Britain and America would probably be allies. So there is a level of cooperation going on from about 1924 between the navies, and it's been building up on their wartime cooperation. There is a reason why the systems are able to be developed and implemented quite so quickly when World War II begins. That's because the navies have been talking about them for roughly 20 odd years. So, whilst there is always a potential, the reality is the relationship between America and Britain has reached a point where them waging active war against each other is unlikely. Economic warfare, that's going on. There's always competition going on. And there's the fact that the Americans don't like empire, that's fine. But the Brits don't like Brits like to wind up the Americans. And as discussed in the logistics video with Sal, whilst the American politicians often talk a big game, the British Royal Navy kind of estimate, and this is based on what they're told by their own American counterparts in the American Navy, they don't fund it. So the reality is they let the Americans occasionally, some of the Americans go a bit bombastic, and they just go, yeah. You going to do anything about it? Well, no, we can't. Okay. Zurkov, it's not the UN, it's the League of Nations, it's not the United Nations, and it's a very different organization. It's basically the US didn't join it because Congress wouldn't allow them. The Americans set it up. It's set up based on Wilson's 14 points, but the Americans then decide not to join it. And honestly, it functions for a while, but like the UN, if no one takes any notice of it, it becomes a talking shop, which doesn't matter. Basically, the whole problem with the League of Nations is it depends on Britain and France wanting to actually pretty much enforce its decisions. And if Britain and France, because of the various treaties, don't feel they've managed to keep their defences in a strong enough order they can enforce the decisions, it has no teeth. If you look at the United Nations, if America wants to enforce the decisions, and if to extent the rest of the Security Council wants to enforce decisions, it gets enforced. If the Security Council don't want to enforce it, or any of them block it, it doesn't happen. So the UN is no better or worse, really, than the League of Nations. How tall was the Nelson Belt? It was a pretty heavy coverage. It was full. They are full dreadnought coverage. With a 28-knot fast squadron incorporated in carriers, would we see them having a larger role in the media? And do you think it would would speed up the Royal Central Fleet arm to Royal Navy? If the Royal Navy appoints Rear Admiral aircraft carriers in 1928 because of the fast squadron actually including them from the get-go, so 2 years earlier than historically, and then they are part of that global cruise, it might well accelerate things. So you might actually have something equivalent to the Inskip Award of probably about 1930. 35 maybe at the earliest, which could shift the final transition from 1939 forward by about the same point, which could change some procurement in run-up to World War II. It might even include the Royal Navy, because you see, one of the things the Royal Navy had a plan for but didn't get implemented because they didn't have time was the idea of supplementing the factories, the alternate factories program by building factories in some of the wider empire, specifically Ceylon. But also there's looks at Australia and other things, and they look at this in terms of. Now, I would agree with most historians who basically ignore this because it's basically position papers being put forward by individual officers as an idea. But the thing is, if you have that paper that come up 2 years earlier and you have them in charge of the procurement that much earlier, they might well look at the procurement battles they're fighting, because rather than fighting for the fighting for control of the fleet air arm and trying to get control of that, they'll be fighting for aircraft for the fleet air arm. That's going to be the difference. They might well push that, because if they can get a factory, let's say a sub factory for Supermarine built in Ceylon, and they can get a sub factory for Fairey built in Ceylon, and Blackburn built in Ceylon, then they can build their aircraft out there. Now, the interesting thing you probably get then happen is the Royal Air Force in the Far East would probably use the same aircraft, and the Royal Australian Air Force and the Royal New Zealand Air Force would probably use the same aircraft as the Royal Navy. So you'd probably end up with a divide on Britain, which would probably go down about the Mediterranean, where down the Suez Canal, whereby anything to the operating from Alexandria to west of that would be operating naval aircraft produced by the naval factories in Ceylon, and you'd probably get stuff operating would be based off the UK factories, and because you could supply the Navy from that quite easily if you could build it. You could build enough to supply those needs. A factory's large enough to supply their needs. The interesting thing would be to be able to get engine factories out there. If they can get that would always be the big question to me. So could they get Rolls-Royce to build a shadow factory out there? Could they get Bristol to build a shadow factory? Because whoever builds a shadow factory out there will be the one who'll be supplying the engines for them. All four of Panzer Chief could be a little bit faster, but there's only so fast you can get diesels at this point. Night Significant. The reason why it probably wouldn't have much of a change on the endurance of cruisers and all those things, and I haven't got into those discussions, is because the endurance is based off the likely supply routes for them. And you have to remember the British have a lot of bases, so the British concept of supply and how they're supplying those ships is very different than the American one, because of where their geography and their basing and the systems they can support their fleet out of. So honestly, the situation, even if they've got all forward ships, they don't need to change them much on the lines of the capability. Thank you. Thank you, Valorant. And Fuller Sir. Thank you. Happy Foximus. Philosopher from Santa Paul's. So yeah, that's the sort of the scenario they're going to be doing. I'm just, it's going to still reflect the geography of their needs and what they need to put in. Right, Luke. Thank you. Sorry, there's a lot of people subscribing in Twitch, and that's very. I just sort of seen the sort of things go. It's got level 2. Oh, cool. Thank you. I have no idea what level 2 means, but thank you. Level 3 hype train. Oh. Pretty much for the Deutschlands to go fast, they'd have to add in a steam plant, yes, and that would change the design and change the. There's also the fact that an all forward Deutschland class would be very different in armor layout. But it could be done. In the ideal world, the Japanese, remember, wanted a 10-7 relationship. So if the British had 24, that scenario, if you're going to work out that, you're probably working out in 5. So the British probably get 25, the Americans get 25, and if the Japanese wanted that, they would probably get 50. They would probably be asked if they would get 15 ships, which is the 5-to-3 ratio, or if they're getting the 5 to 3.5 ratio, probably get it up by a couple more, so they probably would end up with 18 ships. Because it's 14, and then for 5 more, they technically have 3.5 for their 5, which would technically take them to 17.5 in tonnage allowance, but they probably get them up. They probably up them to 18. They probably would. Either way, the Royal Navy and the US Navy then have a 7-ship each in advantage over the Japanese. I discussed that in the Equatorial Treaty series, which is a whole series which goes into all that. If you have a Rolls-Royce in Ceylon, you have a fair chance of the army building a tank factory there later and will take advantage of the terrorists. Certainly. And honestly, if you do have that infrastructure built in Ceylon, then that's your supply line sorted out for supplying, North Africa. Think about the North Africa campaign. If your supplies, instead of your supply line, for a healthy chunk of your supplies, instead of having to go all the way around Africa to get to you, have to come from Ceylon. Because you think about it, all the raw materials you can get from that area. If you have the factory set up and the tooling implemented, which you could do if you start in 1937, well, then you've got that as your infrastructure hub. And instead of having a hub back in the UK and having to supply from that, you can supply it all around. But why do they want an ultra-long range cruiser? Why does the Royal Navy need that? What benefit does that effort and that change to design give them versus using that space for maybe higher speed and better armor? The thing is, you're attracted to the idea of an ultra-long-range cruiser. I would argue, why does the Royal Navy need that or want that in that situation? What does it give them that they don't get? They don't feel. What capability does it give them that they cannot feel from other roles? And for them, also, you have to remember, their main criteria of getting the cruisers in is they don't think about there being endurance and staying there because they're going to be using their gunnery and etc. things, so they're still going to have to come back to resupply their weapons, their ammunition, change their barrels over, all those things. So there's no advantage to it being able to say, and it's a peacetime it's deployment. Well, in this way, the Royal Navy's long-range peacetime deployments, they're going from port to do presence missions. Again, it doesn't assist them. And they don't need to go through the Pacific because they go up from South China Sea. How would you defend Singapore from Japan in early World War II before the USA came in? The same way the British planned to defend it. If you, probably the Japanese won't. At the moment the Japanese come in, the Americans will come in anyway. But leaving that to one side, the British plans for defending Singapore had always been the same thing. You have a whole load of submarines there. The trouble is the Mediterranean had drawn off the submarines, and especially if you have some actual construction, you have some ships based in the Indian Ocean. But leaving that to one side, the British plan had been to have a load of T-class boats which were going to ambush the Japanese fleets and ambush their forces and as the offensive depth. One of the troubles you have in World War II, and then I've done a whole video about the problems of Singapore and defense of Singapore, is the entire plan kind of falls apart because of the fact that the troops who'd been trained up to defend that region, who specialised in that area, had been drawn away to North Africa and find the North Africa campaign, and they had to find other troops to go to that area who were less familiar with the terrain. You have a governor who's so obsessed with the economic role of Malaya that he forgets about defending it. You have probably the best we can say for them is the C team are put in command of the army because the B team and the A team are too busy fighting in North Africa and in protecting the UK. They don't want to send out the very best of the best, so they send out drained people who are probably would be C team in other scenarios. And yeah, pretty much they're just defending. But you remember the British always think about going to, in their battle plan is to always go through the Mediterranean or around Africa in the worst scenarios, but go through Mediterranean, Suez Canal, Indian Ocean to Singapore. That's the British resupply route, and then they would fight any war up the South China Sea, and they have various stages. But again, I've done the British Far East war plans as a video on this channel, and you can go and see that, and that's their war plans. You might think it's possible, you might think it's not possible, but that was their war plans, and that's what they're planning too. I know there are people who like to write and going, this wouldn't be possible. And you have arguments you can make. And that certainly there are parts of them which are not quite as easy necessarily as they're being marked up to be, but they are what they were planning. And that's the problem. You can't, just because we might go that we don't necessarily agree that's the best option, that's the option they were planning. And they're planning based according to that. And you can't really go, well, I don't like their planning, so I think they should change their plans. Well, that was their plans in the 1930s. Oh, I need to do another ad, don't I? Doing it, make it happy. Yeah. But also, the Royal Navy the British didn't expect you have to remember Singapore. Singapore strategy that's conceived in the 1920s, 30s doesn't think Vietnam's going to fall as quickly as it does that the French are going to be, the French are going to be knocked out the war like they are with Vichy France, and then the Japanese are going to be able to move into Vietnam as fast as they do. It doesn't expect the Philippines to fall like it does. There are all sorts of criteria which the British don't expect with the defence of Singapore. It's supposed to give them time. Give them slightly more time. And that's the scenario they have to deal with. So the fact is, everyone's plans in the Far East go to absolute mess. And I would argue that the British are probably the most... Then the British and the Americans basically have an agreement, and the Americans go, well, you guys are kind of handling the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. Yeah. So we'll take the lead in the Pacific. And the British go, fine. We'll take the lead in the Indian Ocean. And that's what you always find interesting, because people forget that the Indian Ocean there's a war going on, and the British are fighting. And by the way, the Indian Ocean is great, because it's the only scenario where you have the Royal Navy taking on Japanese, German, and Italian submarines. They're all operating jointly at points from various points on the Malayan Peninsula. And that's the fun thing they have in the Indian Ocean. So the Indian Ocean is the only scenario where you have you can compare the actual operational capabilities of Japanese, Italian, and German doctrines alongside each other, to an extent. So it's an interesting place. Gary, don't worry. That's patience and talking is what I'm here for. As I said, this is how I fund my research. But yeah, I just hope people enjoy it. And I do these lectures on different topics. Some of them patron suggested, some of them chosen by me, every Thursday. And I do a question and answer / book review session every Sunday. And there's recorded videos in between. But the trouble is, if you look at the British, they have no trouble their cruiser deployments to the Far East. The Town class, the County class do great out there. They're happy with them. There's the whole HMS Liverpool turns up and does the whole Asomamaro incident. You have the Tsingtao incident the year before, which involves HMS Birmingham. Their ships are doing fine with the bases they have there. Yes, it's useful for spending less time downtown, but the trouble is for the British, in the scenario they're operating, that's not the criteria they need to worry about. What they need to worry about is maximising precedence. And the ship out at sea is useful for fighting a war. The ship visiting the foreign ports and doing the constant tours of the foreign ports and showing up when needs to is what's useful for peacetime, for deterrence. And they're balancing those needs. But, the Royal Navy has no trouble. Their cruisers have plenty of range for the Indian Ocean and the Pacific for what they're needing to use them for their portions of the Pacific. This is the thing. The Royal Navy don't have to launch their fleet across the Pacific. That's the thing which is often put to one side. The Americans have to cross the Pacific, and that's why they need the ranges they do. The British are operating up the South China Sea, up the Sea of Japan, East China Sea, those areas. That's where they're operating. Not really operating cross Pacific, they're operating up Pacific. And that's very different in terms of the ranges and requirements. And yeah, it would have been better for them to build up a stronger maritime industry in India, but there is problems with that. And there are problems with other things. At the moment, there are all sorts of issues with British India and misunderstandings of that historically within the UK and at the time and even today. The problem with arming Canada for World War II is they did arm Canada as much as the Canadian government was willing to pay for. That's the thing. They sort of do all sorts of things. And relying on... I wouldn't say it's so much relying on the US to maintain the British Empire in World War II and World War I. But the Americans are a resource they're prepared to make full use of. I would say the Americans are more needed by the British in World War I because of the British reluctance to get into convoys. But then that leads to a whole discussion, which, again, I covered in a video with Sal the other day, which is on YouTube, which is the most recent discussion of the two historians, and Sal Merciago from What Is Going On with Shipping. And in World War II, again, the issue is that the Americans tend to join the wars rather late. But yeah, that is the reality of it. Yeah, British India is a whole interesting scenario because you have to... There are a lot of headlines which go around about it. Then you find out quite a lot of the issues which some of the people are talking about are the fact that the British left quite a lot of the... Yeah, there are issues in that. There are issues with that when we get into that. It depends on what version of neutral the US were in both World Wars. Honestly, as I said, in World War I, if they'd been neutral... The fact is, as long as the British can maintain the blockade, they're winning. But the trouble is, the Americans are never as neutral as people like to think. They're always supplying weapons to people. They're always involved in that sort of scenario. So there's a case of there's neutrality and there's neutrality. But also, you have to remember the Americans also spend quite a lot of time buying arms off the British and French when they do join World War I because they don't have the material. It's one of the really interesting things. They end up buying a lot of equipment off it. And... So yeah, there's all sorts of history when it comes to that one. There's all sorts of discussions when it comes to that one. It's a fun bit of history you get into, but you have to remember the British Empire is one massive pool of infrastructure. And you also have to be quite careful about how you approach it because there is a lot of... How do I put this? The Cold War has had a lot of impact on people's views backwards and forwards of what the Empire was like. And how the Empire was for all nations. But I've had some very interesting discussions over the years with historians from around the world on the subject of the various empires. And pretty much the British could have made better use of it and could have run it better, but they didn't do too badly compared to some. It's kind of the thing of I'm not in about the whole what about history, but it's when you're when you're talking to a historian from the Congo who's basically going, yeah, the French Empire were even better than some of the ones we got. Ooh. It might push the super cruisers earlier. It might push things like the Alaska class earlier, but that's going to again depend on the treaties. Because if the treaties are there, it's fun. Yeah, and I am a naval historian. This is the point. I do a bit economics and I do the politics and I do some of the stuff, but I would have to say I would always say for the admin of colonies, etc., and things that happens there, whilst I've read the books, and I have to read the books for background and stuff, I am nowhere near what I would call an expert, so that's why I tend to avoid them as a topic to talk through. Because I've got friends who are experts, and someday I might try and get some of them on the two historians if they're. But a lot of the historians I find in that area of history are very reticent about going on YouTube and things like that because they're worried people are going to misconstrue their words and, you know, cause them trouble. And you sit there and go, I just have to deal with wereboos on a regular basis who try and tell me that the Bismarck was the greatest battleship ever known to mankind, and I sit there and go, no, it really wasn't. But yeah. But that's fun. What do you think of Nathan Oken? Yeah, he that was the guy. That's the gentleman behind Navweps, who I was actually. What is sad for me with Nathan is that I was just about to get in contact with him and was hoping to have a nice long discussion and chat with him, and he died in January. So, yeah. For sort of, not just Yamato and Musashi would wreck Bismarck, but there's these things called the Littorio class of the Italian Navy, which would wreck Bismarck. There are, the list of ships which would wreck Bismarck goes pretty long and pretty large. It's just not, it's not a good scenario for it. Yeah. It's just, so yeah, I have that's the group I usually have to fund the deal. So in nicest way, I sit there and go, I'm not gonna. You have far more trouble than me. I'm not gonna push you all, but if you ever want to come on my channel, it's a fairly safe space because most people, when they seem to get involved in naval history and interested in it, they seem to be fairly willing to at least listen to the other side of an argument, even if they don't agree with it. If that makes sense. This is what I found in naval history, especially on YouTube. People always seem to be willing to listen to the discussion, even if they're not necessarily they don't agree with it. At least that's my chance. Steve Clarke, if Alex had one subscriber for every wereboo comment, he would have silver play button 2 years ago. Look, if I had a subscriber for every of one of the wereboo comments, which come me, especially the sweary ones, I wouldn't have a silver play button. I'd be on a platinum play button. Okay? I would be... don't take this wrong way, but me and Drac would be minted. We would be literally... We wouldn't be just funding our own research. We'd be funding entire university departments of researchers with the money we'd get if we had as many subscribers as we have comments from wereboos who hate us. It would be overwhelming. That's just the history of it. That's just the fun stuff. Yeah. Naval history nerds are fun. Oh, I would love to do a video with the Chieftain. The Chieftain and I have talked on WhatsApp, and I've talked with the Chieftain on WhatsApp and a few other things, and I would love to have the Chieftain on because the Chieftain has the greatest sense of humor one of the greatest sense of humors I work with. There are a few. It's like the Ship Shape crew. We go off on do these trips with each other, and it's because we can all laugh away. Philosopher, I won't repeat that just in case my little cousins are listening, but yeah. Pretty much. That's it. There'll be a massive research now. What's your ideal ship in your opinion? Oh, look, I have talked about ideal ships in the past, and it depends on the period and what you're building with. In terms of aircraft carriers, for the World War II era, the Maltas and Midways are pretty much the best designs you can get out there, in my opinion. In terms of capital ships, if I'm designing on Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts, I usually am aiming for 9 to 12 16.5-inch guns and at least 28 knots of speed, because that usually works well for me. And I will churn those out. And that's why the ship design things is one of the reasons why I do a UAD stream every Sunday morning on Twitch. It's one of the reasons why I do that stuff, because I can do ship design there. World of Warships I can't do ship design on, but you know, I occasionally do World of Warship streams as well, because I chat through the designs. And if people ask me questions on Twitch when I do them, and I do Timberborn as well, because Timberborn is one of those games I do when I relax. It's a very easy builder game. But yeah, it's fun. UAD is a good thing for designing. But as I said, my usual battleship is 9 to 12 16.5-inch guns, depending on what I want to do. My usual destroyers, well, I wrote a book called Troubles, Battles and Darings, which, as I talked about earlier, and honestly, the Daring class are about as fine as you can get. Oh, Timberborn is just about to get really cool. They've got pneumatic tubes and all sorts of things coming. And I have the thing which you add on to have steam trains, so yeah, I have that. And yes, we do now have flying beavers. I managed to complete the beaver pulp before Christmas. Yeah, and the city builders are a nice way to relax. Anyway. Right, as I said, I'm going to go quickly have a quick bio break, and then I'll be on Discord if people want to chat. I'll be in the general chat. And thank you everyone for being here. I'll answer a couple more questions before I go, but that's just a heads up that I am heading off. Gregory Zukov, should Britain do more on diesel power plant for their ships pre-World War II? Do you think that the power plant had better potential? I think for Britain, because you see, one of the things is the Germans can go to diesel power plant route because that's where their infrastructure lies. For Britain, if you go to more heavily to diesel power plant route, you have to build up the infrastructure to support the diesel power plant route, including all the training and all the construction, all the things for it. So for Britain, in the case of if you put the money into that, well, that's something else you're not putting the money into. So for Britain, it makes sense to keep the steam plants. The main trouble you have with that, though, is that the British pick a steam plant they have peel off in 1937 with the steam plant design they have sort of then. 1935 with the steam plant the design from then. The Americans are about 1937-38 with their steam plant design, which is why they have that higher boiler pressure and they can do all that. So if the British had peeled off their war build later boiler, they would have had a higher pressure boiler, and I think that would have made it more useful. That would have given some of the efficiency and range that people tend to hold against them. Yeah, Sierra Studios were good for Lucifer. They were. I did used to like them. Thank you, Vision. And Robert Dennett. In my Naval role-playing game, set in 1799, the system said the new ship designer commissioned as a private designer ordered 4,000 BM prototype hull for a new warship. What would it be like? It would probably be a very fast frigate. In 1799, it would be a very, very fast frigate. But that could be useful. You could probably make it probably a decent fifth rate, maybe even getting into a fourth rate in total number of guns, but it's probably got a single deck of guns. And that's what it's going to cover. It's going to count as a single deck of the guns, so it's going to be a fifth or sixth rate in its official rating. Because basically, you have to remember, in terms of gun decks, first and second have three gun decks, third and fourth have 2, fifth and sixth have 1. In terms of how you build them, of how they built up in that time period. A very fast frigate. Yeah, it's not going to be a Razé because it's not going to be cut down, but it would be. Yeah, it would be probably not a frigate. Further, you're thinking carronades. I don't think it'd be carronades. I think it would be probably it depends who you're building it for. If you're building for the Americans, possibly carronades. But if you're building for the British, it's going to have long guns. Because the reason why the British prefer long guns over carronades, whilst it does give you a slightly decreased it does give you a decreased size of bombardment. It does give you better range. And the reason the British tended to prefer the range of the long guns versus the carronades is that it allowed them to use more distance for engagements, especially when they're hunting down privateers. When they're trying to engage them, the long guns tend to help. And just the point is, and just the channel, my friendly mate to be around is, remember, my little cousins watch the channel, so we tend to, my little cousins being very young, we tend to keep the language sort of PG-13 in the chat. Just because if they, I'm the only boy in 40 cousins, okay, right? If their little ones learn words because of me, I'm dead. Literally. So we keep it PG-13 just to keep me breathing, because it's not fair, okay? 40-1. You can say there are odds you can win, but that's the sheer number of body mass is going to squish me, okay? Anyway, thank you very much, Aaron, for here. Thank you for chatting. I've got some of the year of leadership up against is still on. There's more being added in. This is the year of leadership. What next year's Tuesday videos are all going to be about. We got some good admirals there. I'm getting suggestions in from people, and yeah. How big is 1,000 tons Bertham? That depends on your but 4,000 BM tons is, yeah, you're probably not looking much different to, I think you're probably looking at roughly, Cutty Sark, its tonnage from memory. Yeah, you're looking at something which is a little bit bigger than the Cutty Sark, I think, in terms of tons Bertham. Okay, a little bit bigger than the Cutty Sark. Take care, everyone, and hope you enjoyed. And as I said, yeah, I'm taking suggestions in for this if there are people with more suggestions, because I've decided most, but I'm, you know, some people said for me, Yi, for sort of Admiral Yi, etc., Yi Sun, and a few others of the admirals that are from the Far East be quite fun to put in. I've got Togo Hayachiro in there because I've got the Battle of Tashima, logistics, learning, and application, and I want to basically do a profile of Hayachiro versus his Russian counterpart, because I think that'd be fun. Rozensky is a very good admiral, and I think comparing the two and contrasting two would be interesting. So basically, when I do battles, I'm going to be comparing all the leaders involved and doing some personality analysis and comparing them a little bit for you. When I'm doing individual profiles, that's going to be part of it. So it's going to be a mixture of the two throughout the year. And there's a few battles I've put up for topics potentially for people. And yeah, so we're working through them. It's going to be fun. And key ships can't response videos. Yeah, let's put it this way. Knight, as I've said, I am back to a certain degree of strength, but it's a case of it's how much energy I have as the rest of the pneumonia. I am recovering from stamina-wise. I'm getting there, but it's going to take time. Everything the doctors told me is it's going to take time. I think if I can start back at the gym in February, which is when I'm supposed to be able to start back at the gym, and I can build my stamina up, start really building up my stamina again, then I will catch up with my normal recording routine. But until then, I'm sorry, things are what they are, and I'm sorry about it. I'd like to do more, but there's a limit to what my body will do. I don't sleep any more than I used to, but it's just a case of it just reached the point in which I'm not doing any more. Oh, the U.S. Bureau of Ordnance getting the mess it was in the beginning of World War II. Oh, that's not leadership. That's just bureaucracy. That'd be the year of bureaucracy. And I'm never doing the year of bureaucracy. I'm not. I like my hairline where it is. I'd like more. My hair is starting to grow back, which is a good thing. And the hair is starting to get thicker again and better again. And I'm putting this down to the fact I'm through the stress of the move and all the other stuff. But yeah. Why put me through a year of bureaucracy? Why would you do that to me? And that's not happening. That's just not happening. Take care, everyone, and thank you. Well, yeah, basically, once I got the right treatment, it got better quite quickly with the pneumonia. But the trouble is, it took a while for people to realise I had pneumonia, because it's partially my own fault. Okay, I do admit that. I walked down to the hospital and I did all sorts of walking around at the time, and I walked down to the doctors, and so they didn't think I was as bad as I was. But I didn't want to drive while having massive coughing fits, because I was worried, well, if you're in charge of a car and you have a massive coughing fit, especially on the roads we had in our local area, they're quite narrow roads. If you have a coughing fit and there's, I don't know, a kid in the road or something like that, you could maybe miss them or hurt them. So I just thought, no, I don't want to do that. I don't think I would, but I don't want to run the risk, so I'll walk down. It was a sensible thing. But because I walked down, they weren't sure how ill I was. And so, yeah, it took a while for them to figure out, till they did an X-ray and went, you have pneumonia in both lungs. This explains your high blood pressure and everything else. Oh, frigate. And you can always tell when doctors are thinking, oh, frigate, because it's when they put you on 5 different antibiotics. And then it's a case of, yeah, you guys were really worried about me. You're putting me on so many antibiotics, I can see the inside of my eyelids. Oh, it was fun. It was fun. Take care, everyone, and thanks for watching, and hope you enjoyed. And as I said, I'll be on Discord after a quick bio break. Toodles.